Hi everyone, this video is a retrospective and analysis on The Last of Us. The Last of Us released in the summer of 2013 as a PlayStation exclusive by Naughty Dog. It is the fourth entry of their third-person cover-based stealth shooter games, following the third entry in the Uncharted franchise. The Uncharted games are well known for their fun wit and mindless action, and while The Last of Us can also somewhat fit this description, it acts more like a spiritual successor to Uncharted, in the sense that it maintains many of the same elements that make up an Uncharted game, but with some significant changes that set them apart. In this video, I will be going into quite a bit of detail about The Last of Us, trying to leave no stone unturned regarding its gameplay mechanics, AI design, characters, and story. Before we begin, however, I think it's important that you know my history with this game, so you have a better grasp of where my thoughts are coming from. Prior to playing The Last of Us, I had played a lot of Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, immensely enjoying the single-player experience for the cinematic action spectacle that it is. Later on, I played The Last of Us shortly after it released, and if you were to ask 18-year-old me back then, he would have said that it's the best game ever made, introducing him to a grounded, well-realized world with unforgiving gameplay and a story that is perhaps presented better than any other he's seen in gaming. My view on the game has however become more nuanced over the years, and together with the anticipation of the release of The Last of Us Part 2 is largely the reason I'm making this video. Over the years since its release, I've played The Last of Us for countless hours, completing it several times on all difficulties, and in my time playing it, I've naturally developed a couple of thoughts on the game, in addition to improvements that I hope will be addressed in the sequel. I've played both the PlayStation 3 version and the remastered version for the PlayStation 4. Despite this, all the footage and discussion will be made regarding the remastered version, since there isn't much of a difference between them and the remastered version looks prettier and runs better. That being said, I will be spoiling the entirety of The Last of Us in this video, so if you haven't played it yet, I would recommend you do so before watching. However, in the event that you're on the fence about playing the game, or simply just don't have the means to play it, it's probably okay to keep watching a little while longer.
Can we hear us on the radio?
Yeah, sure thing.
First off, I think it's relevant to state what Naughty Dog's intentions were when making The Last of Us. In interviews, the directors of The Last of Us have stated that, in their opinion, video games are not being exploited to its full potential as a storytelling medium. In fact, it's being wasted in far too many games that are released today. The idea is that when you're playing a game and holding that controller, you're essentially in that world and participating in what happens there together with the characters. That is a connection between the consumer and the medium that is not found anywhere else. Now, if the game designers can make you feel that you really are there with the characters on that journey through gameplay and cinematics, and you're invested in the story that is being told, you should, in theory, feel what the characters are feeling. So the intention they had when making The Last of Us was to fully harness this potential that video games have for storytelling to tell a story of the blossoming of a relationship, step by step from antagonistic to loving, in a believable and natural way using gameplay and cutscenes.
Bitch made it out. For sure he did.
Already at the start of the game, players can be split into two groups. Those who went into this experience blind, not knowing anything about the game prior to release, and those that maybe watched a thing or two leading up to it. Depending on which group you belong to would likely determine the reaction to the opening of the game. People in the first mentioned group probably wouldn't think much out of the ordinary of the intro. The player wakes up as a young girl and gets to witness everything going to shit around her. On the other hand, people in the second group would likely notice that the girl in the opening cutscene is not the same one that's plastered on the cover of every advertisement leading up to the release of the game, and might get an uneasy feeling about that. I feel pretty certain saying that Naughty Dog intentionally drew attention to Ellie being Joel's daughter in the advertisements, so that when you actually first play the game, you'll be surprised to know that's not the case, because she's nowhere to be found here. She's actually not even born yet. This girl on the couch is actually Joel's daughter, and considering this is a game about the outbreak of an infectious parasite and essentially the end of the world, it's natural to question what's gonna happen to this girl, since she was never seen in anything Naughty Dog put out prior to this game. This takes away some of the unexpectedness of what's going to happen towards the end of the introductory sequence. Some people like this, having the looming threat of knowing something's gonna happen to Joel's daughter, and some people think this lessens the impact of it. Regardless, it's safe to say that Naughty Dog made an attempt here to play with the player's expectations, for better or for worse. I think it's safe to say that today most people can be put into the second group, considering The Last of Us' giant commercial success, having sold 17 million copies between the PlayStation 3 and the PlayStation 4 remaster by 2018, and likely a lot more now that The Last of Us Part 2 is right around the corner. The game opens with a cutscene introducing Joel and his daughter Sarah. It puts a lot of weight on their relationship and shows that Joel cares very much for his daughter. When finally gaining control, the player, to many people's surprise, wakes up as Sarah and controls her moving through the house, entering different rooms and inspecting different items that are scattered throughout the house. All the while everything is going to shit around you, slowly at first, but it builds up momentum fast. By far the best event of those that happen in the house has to be when the player is watching a TV that's playing in Joel's room. When the player enters the room, a live news show is being broadcast, and shortly afterwards, this happens.
What was that?
The explosion is right outside the window, down the street. Now, if the player didn't already feel at unease before this, he or she likely will now. It's a good but simple moment that makes what's going on feel a lot more immediate and close to the player. Building up the courage to move on, the player has to move downstairs. There are some notable interactable events here too, that pulls the player further into the world and the situation Sarah is in. Entering what looks like Joel's study triggers a cutscene where Joel barges in through a glass sliding door from what I assume is the garden. The neighbor has become infected, and neither Joel or Sarah understand what's going on. Joel ends up having to shoot the neighbor, something that clearly horrifies Sarah. Joel takes a second to calm Sarah down before leaving the house with Tommy, his brother who just arrived in the driveway. The three of them drive away with the aim of getting out of the city. On the road, the player is treated to a scenario where Joel refuses to help a family. We see that Joel is a man who puts him and his loved one's safety before others. When they get to the city, the roads are jammed. Everyone had the same idea to drive out of the city, resulting in no one getting out. Trying to take an alternative path, their car crashes, and Sarah's leg gets hurt, so Joel has to carry her on foot. From here on, the player takes control of Joel. I question how well this sequence works, carrying Sarah through the streets, as it essentially functions as a cutscene where you just hold up on the analog stick while following Tommy. The player doesn't really learn any mechanics in the opening of the game, which has always been strange to me, and it results in the game having to do that later on. However, in relation to the end of the game, this sequence is nothing short of excellent. As they attempt to escape the city on foot, Joel and Ellie are stopped by a man in the military, carrying an assault rifle and wearing full military gear. This is less important at the moment, but serves a purpose that becomes clear later on. The man stops Joel and Sarah and asks his superiors what to do. Joel begs him to let them go, but gets no response while the man listens to get orders. It's quiet for a while, until the man lifts the gun, shining the flashlight on Joel and Sarah. Joel quickly realizes what's about to happen and does his best to shield Sarah, as the man opens fire. Now, if the player were in the group that didn't know anything about the game beforehand, I'd go out on a limb and say that this part will take you by surprise. I say this having been part of that group on my initial playthrough. And even if you were part of the second group who knew a thing or two about the game and maybe expected this to happen, you probably wouldn't expect it to be as horrific as it is. Because only Sarah gets hit, while Joel is left to helplessly watch his own daughter die in his hands. For this part, Naughty Dog doesn't hold back at all, delivering a proper gut punch, showing in full from the moment Sarah gets hit to when she dies. to let the player witness firsthand what this violence does and how it affects Joel. The player gets to see a glimpse of Joel mourning Sarah before the scene cuts to black and an intro sequence rolls. The player will likely have to sit for a moment with the feeling after witnessing this. If the game had instantly cut to 20 years later, as it will, with Joel and his new partner, it would feel jarring and wouldn't let the player properly process what just happened. The decision to bridge this gap with an intro was frankly a necessity. In addition, the intro isn't entirely useless in itself, but nothing spectacular either. Besides some stylish visuals, it introduces the player to the Fireflies and glances over the events that happened in the aftermath of the outbreak, which is a nice touch as to not waste any other player's time. Considering how much Naughty Dog wanted to introduce in the opening of the game, I think it's nothing short of amazing that they managed to pace it as well as they did, and keep it as short as it is, at around 15 to 20 minutes. This helps to make the opening of the game one of the most memorable parts of the game. Now this is sadly soured by the following part of the game, which has a noticeable drop in quality.
Here we go.
After the intro sequence, we see Joel wake up in a new place. It's now 20 years later. Tess is introduced as Joel's partner. They're smugglers and seem to be doing fairly well in the post-apocalyptic world, maybe even better than most. The game never explicitly explains the extent of their relationship, but it becomes clear that they at the very least care and trust each other. Some people think that they're a couple, but I could never see that for myself. To me, they always seemed more like close friends. Just before Joel woke up, Tess had been jumped by some guys working for a man named Robert, who owes them a lot of guns, so they decide to pay him a visit to return the favor. On the way to Robert, the player is introduced to the new world. It's dirty, trash is spilling into the streets, the military controls everything under martial law. Anyone who's been on the outside is tested for the virus, and if they test positive, they're executed on the spot. That's what life is like now in the quarantine zones. Now, since the intro didn't really include many mechanics important to the gameplay, they have to be introduced now. So let's dive shallowly into the gameplay. We will be diving deeper into the gameplay mechanics later, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible here, to only have this as an introduction to the gameplay mechanics, and avoid getting into the complicated territory where gameplay and story is heavily mixed, as it is in a large part of the game, for good and for bad. Let's start with the most obvious, the camera. It's placed behind the player at a comfortable length. The camera can be moved around without Joel having to turn around, making him feel more agile, and not like he has a turret for a head. Outside of combat, there isn't much bound to the controller that the player can do except climb and traverse the environment. You have the left analog stick to move forward and the right one to look around. The first left trigger acts as a modifier between walking and running. The circle button lets Joel crouch, making him able to fit under tighter spaces, in addition to improving Joel's stealth in combat. The player can hide behind obstacles, and the crouch function also lessens the noise made when approaching an enemy. The cross button jumps or climbs over obstacles, and the triangle interacts with stuff, such as picking up bullets, weapons, upgrade material, crafting material, or collectibles. This button is also bound to talk to companions, and interact with pieces for a puzzle that has to be solved, like a ladder that has to be moved or something. Using materials found in the world, the player can craft some items on the go, or upgrade the weapons at certain locations. These are most of the choices the player has for parts of the game. However, in combat is where the bulk of the gameplay is naturally found. The player can shoot, punch, throw objects or bombs, strangle or use enemies as human shields, and all the variations that these abilities can be combined to make for fun and interesting gameplay. As for the flow of the combat, it mostly comes down to what style the player prefers. In almost all situations, the player will start out unnoticed by the enemies, leaving the door open to go for a stealth reactive approach, responding to enemy positions around you while having to position yourself in smart locations in the environment, as to not get noticed, and then to carefully take out enemies without getting spotted. Being as versatile as possible with Joel's moveset to make this playstyle work. It's a high risk, high reward playstyle, since if you're spotted in a bad position, surviving can be an uphill battle. But on the bright side, the playstyle doesn't require the use of ammunition and other finite resources, giving the player more leeway to use that sometime later, when it's needed. On the other hand, the player can go full Terminator and slaughter everything, playing much less of a reactive role and letting the enemies come to the player while cutting them down instead. This playstyle is very high risk, and yields less of a reward than the stealth approach, but it goes a lot faster. Now let's see how all this is put together in the tutorial.
Joel, give me a hand with this.
This is a heavily tutorialized section of the game, and is stretched over a time that is far too long without any interesting gameplay or challenge. This didn't bother me as much on my first time playing the game, but became more evident on my second, third and fourth and so on playthrough, to the extent that I now always just want to skip it. I actually timed my last run, and it took me pretty much exactly 45 minutes to complete this part of the game, which is way too long for any tutorial in my opinion. If we take into account that I played the game before, and that I'm likely more skilled than a person new to the game, I wouldn't say that it's a stretch to say that someone who played this for the first time would probably take an hour to do so, or more. I understand that the game had a lot to introduce at this point in the game, with several storylines needing to get started and developed, in addition to gameplay mechanics needing to be introduced to the player. But with that said, I'm not exaggerating when I say that this is the worst part of the game, by a wide margin. But anyway, let's get started. The tutorial begins after an attack on the quarantine zone by the Fireflies. Joel has to patch himself up. The game stops to explain how to equip and use health kits, shortly followed by an introduction to the booster mechanic, a Naughty Dog staple at this point. Then there's a ladder puzzle, something the player will see a lot of in this game. Delving into a nearby building serves to show the spores to the player, which honestly is less of a mechanic as Joel automatically equips the gas mask, but is more for atmosphere. A man begs for Joel to kill him due to having gotten infected, which serves as the player's introduction to shooting. Right afterwards is the first combat section, versus 3 newly infected. The game stops to teach the player of Joel's enhanced hearing that can see enemies through walls, as well as stealth and stealth takedowns. You're once again shown a ladder type puzzle after this, but this time with a wooden plank. The player becomes aware that the companions can be used to help with puzzles. You enter another part of the quarantine zone, showing off how people live now and what type of people live here. Seems like everyone here knows Tess and respects her a lot, something that can't be said for Joel. You're promptly thrown into a combat scenario against 2 humans, and afterwards have to perform the boost mechanic again, which is followed by another combat section versus humans where stealth is heavily incentivized. This leads to another combat scenario that's harder to complete with only stealth, but not by much. If you find the shiv in this area, the game will halt to explain how it works. After that, there's yet another combat section, combining the previous lessons. Once you finish this, you find Robert and have to chase him down. When you catch up with him, a cutscene plays where Joel and Tess play bad cop with Robert. It turns out Robert sold Joel and Tess's guns to the Fireflies, and Tess shoots Robert in the face, twice, and I know it's not the most relevant of criticisms, and I guess it shouldn't really bother me at all since it's such a small thing, but Tess firing 2 bullets in Robert's face, objectively 1 more shot to the face than needed in a world where ammunition is very valuable. So valuable in fact that Joel and Tess were willing to murder about a dozen people just because Robert wouldn't give them some guns just rubs me the wrong way. And I can already hear people in the comments jokingly writing down Zombieland's second rule. She just had Joel snap his arm like a twig. If anything, Joel should have broke his neck or choked him out. I mean, the man obviously loves choking people out, so why didn't they just do that? So Marlene shows up, Queen Firefly, and offers them a way to get the guns back, in exchange that they smuggle something for her to the Capitol building outside of the quarantine zone. So they follow her back to her hideout. On the way there, they encounter another combat section versus humans that can mostly be stealthed through. When they arrive at the hideout, it turns out that Marlene wants them to smuggle a girl. Joel is hesitant to do this at first, but is convinced by Tess to go through with it, as it's just cargo. Joel and Tess split up. Tess checks that Marlene is telling the truth about having the guns to pay them, while Joel takes care of the girl, Ellie. Joel walks with Ellie to the north tunnel, where they are to wait for Tess. On the way, there's a new kind of puzzle that's introduced, involving a dumpster that the player can move and climb on. When arriving at the destination where Joel and Ellie are to wait for Tess, another cutscene plays, drawing attention to how little Joel wants to interact with Ellie, while at the same time reminding the player of his daughter. Now, if that seemed like it was unnecessarily drawn out, it's because it is, and I went through that as quick as possible. The good news is that we're finished going through the tutorial now, and the bad news is that even though we're finished with the tutorial, there are still things in it that needs to be addressed. The first and most obvious things I'm going to say is that the length of this could have been drastically cut down. without losing much in terms of the tutorial for the player. There are too many times the player has to repeat mechanics that have already been learned. Having to boost Tess twice is one too many times you have to boost someone in a tutorial. I know it doesn't seem like much, but that one boost is a whole part of an area that the player has to traverse through just because that mechanic was to be added. There are also too many repetitive combat encounters where the player just has to do the same thing over again. Cutting down on this, I bet the tutorial could have been made to only take about 20 to 30 minutes to complete. There is no clear indication of where the tutorial definitely ends, but I consider it to be when you leave the quarantine zone. Some of you might disagree and think that it's earlier or even later, but for me it ends when Joel and Ellie meet up with Tess and the player exits the quarantine zone. Pop-up suggestions end at this point, and the game stops forcing the player into situations where they have to perform some mechanic at a rapid rate, with the last one being the generator that the player has to activate to power the lift. The player is also finally introduced to a new area, the outside, and all of this combines to make it feel like the proper start of the game. I feel like I'm being overly negative, so I'll add that it isn't all bad in the tutorial though. Conversations with Tess are engaging and interesting throughout this time, and are put to great use later in the game. It definitely helps to keep the tutorial from being a total letdown, even on later playthroughs. A large part of the game actually shines through these conversations, much like they do with Ellie later in the game. While Joel, Tess and Ellie are sneaking out of the quarantine zone, they spot some military guards up in the distance. They wait for the military men to pass before they proceed, but end up getting ambushed by them regardless of their own caution, which triggers a cutscene. The guards test all of them for the infection. Knowing that the test will show as positive on Ellie, she decides to stab one of the guards, resulting in Joel and Tess having to kill them. As it turns out, Ellie's infected, but she's immune. Before they can discuss what to do with Ellie, now that they know she's infected, the discussion is promptly cut off when they're spotted by more guards arriving to the scene. This leads into a stealth section where Joel, Tess and Ellie have to escape from the guards. Once they're safe, the discussion that was previously interrupted is resumed. Two things are revealed now. That whatever happened to Ellie is thought by the Fireflies to be the key to finding a vaccine. That's why Marlene wanted Joel and Tess to smuggle her. Marlene would have done it herself, but in her condition, she would have never made it. And secondly is Tess's willingness to latch onto this idea, hoping that helping delivering Ellie for this cause will redeem her previous actions that have been less than altruistic. Joel, however, seems hesitant to help with this cause, and just wants to return to the quarantine zone now that this complication has come to light. The infection that was the cause of all this chaos in the opening of the game has at this point, 20 years later, devastated the whole world. It was caused by a cordyceps fungus that spread to humans due to infected crops from South America. What's so great about this is that the cordyceps fungus is actually a real pathogen. It infects through spores in the air, and once it finds a host, it will take control of the body. When finished using the host, the fungus will kill it and release more spores to infect more individuals. The big but here is that they do not infect humans. It only affects insects. Although in the game it is explained that the cordyceps have mutated, making it able to jump to humans. For humans, the pathogenic cycle is tweaked in certain ways. Once a person is infected, he or she is expected to turn within 2 days, losing their minds, and attacking anything that isn't them, making them essentially into regular zombies. After a while, the host will enter the next stage of infection, where the fungus starts sprouting from the host's head, cleaving its face in two. During this process, the host loses its eyesight. Due to them being blind, this form of zombies have developed some form of echolocation to be able to move around. If the host survives for long enough, they will then enter the final stage of the infection. In this stage, they develop fungal plates that acts as armor and gains the ability to throw spore bombs. Or in the case where the fungus kills the host, it will spire out from the body and cling to anything close in the environment, then to release its spores, to infect other individuals. Even though this fungus is shown to be the demise of humanity in the game, it isn't portrayed as something entirely ugly. The later infected stage, or clickers as they're called in the game, are very dangerous, but at the same time they're beautiful. The fungus sprouts in many different shapes and in many different colors. At the same time as they are objectively a 0 out of 10, you can't help but see some beauty in them. See how good that is? When the developers actually take their time to think of something creative and how it interacts with the world around it, making it feel like something new and fresh. I know that the post-apocalyptic zombie scenario has been done a million times before. There's not much new ground to tread here, but it's really nice to see that someone at least tries to do a more refreshing take on it. Moving on, the player meets their first clicker. Tess explains that they're sort of blind, that they use sound to see, like bats who use echolocation to navigate their surroundings. The aptly named clickers make clicking sounds to achieve the same effect to navigate an area. I've seen people point out that the game is wrong in this explanation since the clickers also react to sounds that the player makes in the environment, which means that they don't use echolocation but actually just react to sound. This argument doesn't really make any sense. I don't see why they can't have both hearing and the ability to use echolocation, just like bats do. I've even seen blind people in real life who do exactly that. Another point of contention is that the clickers can find the player even when standing still, something that should be impossible if the clickers were really using echolocation to see. This is a purely contextual argument. In the event that you're standing completely still in the path of a clicker as it walks towards you, it will still become aggressive as soon as you come in contact with it. Which doesn't make sense since to the clicker you might just as well be another inanimate object in the environment. And in my hours of playing The Last of Us, I've never seen a clicker go toe to toe with a chair or the corner of a table. However, many of the clickers have spent a lot of time in these environments, maybe years, which may have led them to learning these environments like the back of their own hand. And much like the back of your own hand, you would notice when a sudden change has taken place there. Therefore, it's not unreasonable to assume that the clickers would easily recognize a sudden change in the environment, and be able to understand that it's due to something living and foreign having entered this environment, which leads to them attacking the player when they obstruct the clicker's normal path. The other context this argument can be applied to is after the player has been noticed by a clicker, and then proceeds to stand still in hope of the clicker not being able to see you, thinking that the clicker's ability to see you is similar to that of a T-Rex. This is different than the last example and just plain wrong. Once noticed by a clicker, or a bat for that matter, its perception is sufficiently no different than that of a human. Standing still and hoping for the best will do you just as much good as getting down on your knees and start praying to dog to save you. A little bit afterwards, the player encounters its first living clicker, which jumps onto Joel. As this happens, you enter a cutscene and the player is given a button prompt to mash to get out of the clicker's hold. Regardless of whether or not you press the button prompt you're given, Tess will still save Joel and shoot the clicker. The addition of this button prompt is just useless padding, perhaps added to give the player a false sense of urgency in the situation. I would like it more if I had control of Joel and had to fight the clicker myself, or if Naughty Dog insisted that it had to be a short cutscene where clickers are introduced, to leave it as a cutscene without the button prompts. Fast forward to the next encounter with a clicker, the player is shown that you can use bottles or bricks as a distraction to lure infected to the sound that it makes when it breaks. In the next section you find your first weapon, aside from the 9mm pistol that Joel is equipped with from the start. The gun you find is a revolver that holds 6 bullets, so you know some shit is about to go down now. This is given to the player right before what I consider to be the most challenging section in the whole game due to the sudden spike of difficulty. What I mean is after this section the game never demands this much of the player for the entirety of the game. There are certainly other parts of the game that are harder than this, but there is never a leap in difficulty that is as large as the one that the player is faced with here. If you're playing on anything harder than easy, you're likely to die here a couple of times, or at the very least once. The player has just been taught some of the mechanics that are involved to evade combat and is checking if you've been paying attention. Stealth, distract, and silently kill when given the chance. But this section is twisted in its own sort of way. It doesn't let you use the skill set that you've just been taught to complete this section. So if you've been paying attention to what the game has been telling you, it's not unlikely that you're going to try to distract the infected and stealth your way through this section. And if you try that, you're going to be met with a surprise. Because this section is tail-ended by the player having to move a trolley to open a door. Moving this trolley makes a lot of sound and causes all the infected in the area to notice your presence, which will likely probably lead to you being rushed by 8 infected and dying. Instead, I think Naughty Dog intended this to be the player's proper introduction to combat with infected. This small room with 8 or so infected, including clickers and runners that patrol, where you have to kill most of them. And I think it's very poorly communicated to the player. It is possible to do this section undetected, but it's very hard, and likely not something that someone new to the game can do. What you're supposed to do is kill some of the infected silently until you're caught, and then finish off the rest in a mad scramble. This isn't very easy in itself, but definitely doable, even for someone new. This is however not something someone who's playing for the first time is likely to do. They've just been learned the skill set to evade the infected instead of going head to head with them, and are likely to do exactly that. The thing is that I think this section wouldn't be that hard if the player had been introduced to the combat with infected prior to this. An alternative would be to remove the cutscene where Joel is jumped by a clicker to a playable encounter where you have to defeat 1 or 2 clickers. A runner could be introduced to that area as well, so the player would be familiar with fighting both at the same time. Or the section where the player is taught that bottles or bricks can be used to distract infected could be changed so that the player had to fight some of the infected before leaving the area. This would ease the player more into the combat before throwing them to the wolves, or infected in this case. And before you start furiously typing in the comments that the game is supposed to be difficult and the difficulty and misdirection of that section is the purpose, so the player really feels the danger and dread of the situation, I want to say that I agree with that sentiment. I do, however, also think it's unfair to expect that much of the player this early on without preparing them for it. I know I'm coming off as overly negative about this section, but I actually really like it in isolation. Every time I go through it now, I'm always nervous if I've forgotten to kill any of the infected close by before going to the trolley, and it creates this tense mood. The surprise of the trolley alerting the infected in this area is great. It takes the player off guard and puts you in a situation where you have to scramble just to stay alive, and I think it would have worked if the player had been properly introduced to the combat prior to this. However, as an introduction to the combat versus infected, it doesn't really reach its potential. Anyway, after you complete the section you go down to the basement of the building where you find several dead fireflies. The player finds a Molotov cocktail, which then becomes a craftable item using alcohol and a rag. Moving on, you come to a room that's filled to the brim with clickers and runners, but the area is quite large, so it's fine. In this area you can decide to quickly move to the end, kill the one clicker there silently, and get out. Or to kill a couple of them to get some sweet optional loot. I see this area as the culmination of all that the player has been learned up to now. You're faced with the choice of either trying to stealthily completing the section quickly without any mess, or if you're brave enough, explore the area and be rewarded with some loot. It's a nice end to what can be seen as a tutorial after the tutorial. With a proper tutorial for both human and infected enemies out of the way, the player gets a chance to upgrade the weapons they've found so far, which are only 2 weapons. I have a lot to say about the upgrade system, but we'll have to come back to talk about it later, when we've collected more weapons and encountered more enemies. But for now, let's move on. In this level, the player gets separated from Tess and Ellie while sneaking through a narrow corridor. As they're separated, infected appear to chase Ellie and Tess, while Joel is left to find a way back to them. While Joel moves around the environment, he will call out for Tess, never Ellie, since that's what he cares about at the moment. As you progress through the level, you can hear a commotion coming from upstairs, where you find Tess fighting a runner. Afterwards, the whole room has been alerted of your presence, and all the infected charge at you at once. Finishing this room is a mess. Stealth isn't an option, and the player has to punch and shoot their way out of the situation. I think this level works quite well to instill a sense of urgency for the player to quickly get back to Tess to save her, not so much Ellie at this point. By now the player has likely forged somewhat of a connection with Tess through optional and non-optional dialogue, in addition to some combat, which is all used to great effect in the upcoming twist. On the way to the Capitol building is a scene where Joel and Ellie seem to connect a bit, the both of them enjoying the view together. It is however quickly interrupted by Tess, but not before the player is treated to seeing Joel let down his guard as he glances at his broken watch, given to him by his daughter. As they walk up to the Capitol building where they're supposed to deliver Ellie to the fireflies, you find another dead firefly lying in a corner, and Tess's attitudes seem to have changed by the events that just passed. A noticeable hopeful cynicism surrounds her, like she's slowly realizing the hopelessness of the situation. Because as they arrive at the Capitol building, the fireflies, like all the other fireflies you met so far, are dead, and Tess's distress is instantly noticeable as this reality hits her. Joel tries to calm her down, but it doesn't work, since this is her last stop. She was bitten in the previous section, which made this meeting with the fireflies her last chance at redemption. And as it dawns on her that she can't continue to follow the fireflies to deliver Ellie, she proceeds to guilt Joel into continuing her crusade against his own will, evoking their relationship, whatever it is, to make him do her bidding, asking him to make this easy for her, and finally yelling at him to fucking go, really holding nothing back. Before Joel can properly get out an answer, he's interrupted by military forces showing up, forcing him and Ellie to do as Tess wants, just in case her request wasn't already enough. The acting is spot on, the music, the dilemma, all of it coming together makes for one of the better scenes in the game, but not the best one, not even in the top 5 in my opinion. Following this, the military searches for Joel and Ellie, while they try to escape. They are more powerful human enemies than you've encountered before, and makes for a pretty demanding combat section. Interestingly, this section is followed by maybe one of the calmer, if not the calmest area in the game. This seems like an intentional choice made by Naughty Dog, and is something that is repeated several times in the game. There's a cutscene with a lot of information to unpack. This cutscene throws the player into an intense combat section where the player can't really process the information, and lastly a calmer section where the player is meant to dwell on what just happened. It's a tried and true formula and it works really well. There's really only one instance I can think of where the game flips this concept on its head, and it's the game's most powerful pivotal moment. Another thing I want to point out before we move on is that while Ellie and Joel are running from the military, they end up in a sewer where Joel has to wear a gas mask to avoid breathing in the toxic spores. This is fine, but then Joel ends up swimming and going under the water with the gas mask still on. I'm no expert on the subject, but I'm pretty sure that would ruin a gas mask, and a quick Google search confirmed this. I know this is a nitpick, but it really just annoyed me when I played the game. It's almost as if The Last of Us should be held up to a higher standard, making it okay to point out those small failures committed in the game. Moving on to the next scene, Ellie attempts to have a talk with Joel about Tess's death. However, Joel is having none of it. He doesn't want Ellie to even bring up the subject of Tess ever again. This is a case of Joel knowing what he has to do to survive in this world. He can't let his emotional walls down, similar to what is done about his daughter's death. He has to let go of these things or they will end up killing him, which actually segues really well into the remaining parts of the summer chapter, but we'll expand on that idea later on. I don't have too much to say about the section leading up to Bill that I haven't said before or that won't be addressed later at a more fitting time. So for now, I hope it will suffice to say that it's an alright section that is considerably larger and more open than previous parts of the game you've encountered so far, which is a welcome change. Other than that, it doesn't really differentiate itself much from previous sections. It has some pretty visuals, a lackluster puzzle, you find your first upgraded melee weapon, courtesy of Bill, there are gnomes, arcade games, a much better puzzle later on, and of course whistling. You also find the bow and arrow here. Before moving on, I want to add that I just love this weapon. It is so satisfying to stealthily take down enemies from range using the bow, and then pick up the arrow from the corpse, effectively using no ammo. You can't regain the arrow every time you shoot though. From my research, it seems to be dependent on the strength of the shot and whether or not the shot was a clean one. So if you knock the bow all the way back and hit a single shot right in the head, you will often get your arrow back in my experience. As you progress deeper into the city, you may find lots of notes and booby traps left by Bill around town. The notes paint Bill as sort of a nutjob, and the traps reinforce this idea, which is all validated when you finally meet the guy. However, you can't dispute the efficiency of going completely home alone on a whole town in the event of a zombie apocalypse. Continuing onwards, you come to a door with a shit ton of ammo just lying around outside it, which in a game usually means the tougher combat section is right around the corner. As you walk through the door, Joel is ambushed by one of Bill's traps. Joel's foot gets caught in a string of rope and is promptly hung by the ceiling and weighed down by a refrigerator. While Ellie attempts to cut Joel loose, you have to protect her from the incoming infected that heard all the commotion. It's a pretty great and intense set piece. While hanging upside down, your aim is swaying much more than usual, leading to you likely missing a hell of a lot more shots than you normally would, adding to the pressure of dying or wasting ammo. However, while in this set piece, Joel magically has an infinite amount of bullets to fire, and none of the shots you take in this set piece will be removed from your ammo storage after the fight, which I feel kinda cheapens the combat a bit. Imagine if all other encounters in the game were like that. I get that in this set piece an infinite amount of ammo is almost necessary for many players given how many shots are needed to complete it, especially on harder difficulties where you don't have many bullets to start with. But I think every shot fired in the set piece should also have been retracted from your own ammo afterwards. It would reward skilled players with high accuracy and frankly just make more sense than a game that tries to be very grounded. The game supplying the player with a lot of bullets right before the set piece is the game telling you that you will need these, but it ends up just being superfluous ammo to be used whenever you feel like it after the set piece. This part is trying to be chaotic by literally sweeping the player off their feet and making you shoot upside down, and stressful by increasing your sway so much you miss more shots, which I think it succeeds in doing, but it could have been even better if your performance would determine if you had bullets in the following section, which could force you to play more tactical and explore more of your kit until you find more bullets. Something I really wish was the case here. Once the set piece has completed, Joel is saved by Bill, who escorts him away from the infected to a safe zone where a cutscene plays. The first thing Bill does when he meets his old buddy is to chain Ellie to a pipe and check if Joel is showing any symptoms of having been infected, since that would jeopardize his own life. After Bill sees they're healthy, he begrudgingly agrees to help Joel get a car since he owes him a favor, and conveniently he also knows just where to find one. While following Bill to the car, he keeps talking to himself, saying stuff about how he should have left you to die in his trap, and reminding himself to check the barricades he set up around town, you know, like a normal person does. Bill also has a throwaway line here, saying that the infected don't scare him as much as normal people do, and that Joel of all people should understand that better than anyone.
You of all people should understand that.
What does that mean?
Nothing.
The first time I heard this, I thought this line referred to Sarah and what Joel had lost. But after replaying the game, it becomes obvious that it's directed at Joel's past when he used to roll with the hunters. When he used to kill and maybe even eat other people just to stay alive. I just thought this is a pretty neat piece of dialogue that I haven't seen many people point out before. After this, you arrive at Bill's other safe zone. He has like 1,000 of them, I guess. Ellie thinks that she should be equipped with a gun just like Bill and Joel, saying that she can handle herself. But Joel refuses. We will come back to this point later when it's more suitable to talk about it. I know that I'm also skipping other significant parts in this cutscene, but they're better discussed at a later point. So let's get on with it. The player receives the shotgun and the explosive bomb from Bill and continue onwards. Playing on easier difficulties, this section can just be skipped by crouching through the whole thing. This was obviously not intended by the developers, which is best pointed out by Bill himself, as he doesn't give two shits about the clickers right next to him when he opens the door at the end of the path and yells out to Joel.
Hold up. I got a key for that gate.
Actually, when playing on easier difficulties, large parts of the game can be broken like this. You can just stealthily cruise through the game without killing most of the enemies, which in itself can be kind of fun, but it's not how the game was intended to be played. When you get to the high school, where Bill thought there was a working engine, it turns out that it's gone. So you have to cross through the high school that is infested with infected, in addition to a new special kind of infected at the end of this chapter, a bloater. The last stage of the infection cycle, in this game at least. We'll see what The Last of Us Part 2 has in store for us when it comes out. The bloaters have a ranged spore attack that explodes and continuously deals damage when you stand in its area of effect. In addition, the bloater's fungal plates have grown to act as armor for its body, turning them into huge beefcakes that take several more shots than anything else in the game to kill. But much like real beefcakes, they are really weak to fire and can easily be dealt with using Molotovs. It's pretty cool to see that the developers cared enough to consider a life cycle for the infected, showing biological changes for several stages of the infection cycle, and even taking into account how they spread their spores. I hope to see much more regarding this in the sequel. When you finally kill the bloater and move on, you get to a house. The reason Joel, Ellie and Bill went to this house was only to get away from the infected while they can think of another plan to get a working engine. This house, however, turns out to be Frank's house, who was an old acquaintance of Bill. Their relationship is mostly known through the following cutscene, but he is briefly mentioned in an earlier cutscene as someone that Bill cared about. Again, I'm sorry to keep doing this, but we will discuss this cutscene later at the end of the summer chapter. For now, all you need to know is that Frank is the person that had taken the working engine from the high school, and that he had conveniently already put it in a working car in his house. To get the car working, Joel and Bill push the car while Ellie drives. It's a short but memorable section due to its different mechanics of having to alternate between pushing the car and killing incoming infected. Once the car is started, all three of you drive away to a safer location where Bill leaves back to his town, and Joel and Ellie continue on their own to find the fireflies.
We square? We're square. And get the fuck out of my town.
The previous cutscene where Bill leaves flows seamlessly into another cutscene that opens this part of the game. Joel and Ellie are cruising down a road and just talking shit and listening to music, like two normal people. It's a much needed period of levity in a game that is for most part seeped in dark material, like a goth going to a funeral. I really like this scene since it shows off a lot of Ellie's personality, in addition to Joel and Ellie's dynamic when they can just talk. It also contains a cut I find hilarious, where Ellie says she's not even tired after Joel suggests she should go to sleep, and it just cuts to her sleeping. It's no comedic masterpiece, but I find it very endearing. After having driven for a while, they're forced to cross through Pittsburgh due to cars blocking the road. While they're driving through town, they encounter a man that seems to be hurt and in need of assistance. Joel, having been on the other side of this situation, sees through his facade and understands that it's really an ambush. As they try to get away, the ambushers... Do you say that? Ambushers? The people ambushing them? Anyway, their car gets hit by a bus that the ambushing people pushed onto them, ruining their car and forcing Joel and Ellie to fight. It's one of the few instances where the game just throws you into combat without the player having a say in the matter. However, it seems much more organic here than when it happened in the tutorial. After the ambushmen are dispatched of, Joel and Ellie pass through their hideout, where we get more insight into what Joel had to do to survive after the outbreak. What he says here basically confirms that he had to kill innocents to survive. However, we can only speculate as to whether or not he became so desperate as to eat people he killed. Personally, I'm leaning towards that he did eat people for a while in those darkest days that Tommy refers to later in the game. I think this because Joel doesn't seem all that surprised by the fact that the hunters they're encountering were eating people. Instead, he just brushes it off and comments "fucking hunters," which to me signals that cannibalism is something that a lot of hunters have to do to survive, but likely isn't their preferred source of food. After all, in the same room where you find the chopped up bodies, you can find a list of things they've collected from people they've killed. And the hunters do collect other foods, of course. Cannibalism is just a last resort for them, which I think is a whole lot better than framing the hunters as a gang of Hannibal Lecters. This makes the hunters and Joel, when he used to run with them, still redeemable in my opinion. As a side note here, I really like the comparison that's drawn between the hunters and the infected, seeing as both of them eat humans, showing how even the non-infected are losing their humanity in this world. Currently, Joel and Ellie's objective is to cross that bridge in Pittsburgh, to continue westward to find their fireflies. On their way, they have to cross through a hotel. It's quite a difficult section to get through without killing anyone, or at least getting noticed. Even on easy mode, you'd have to know what to do and where to go to avoid everyone. So most people end up fighting here. And that's a good thing since this place has some of the best combat versus humans in the entire game. There are so many rooms to hide away and to stealthily take down the hunters, or to lose them when you inevitably get caught. In addition, this level offers you several paths to get through the hotel that feel very natural. The hotel's layout is constructed like a maze, so at times you have no idea if you're even going the right way. Some of the paths lead you past many enemies and gets you quicker out of there, and other are dead ends that at times leads to loot. This is a great change and makes this section stick out to me. In many levels you usually have a clear goal to reach or an easily identified path to follow. This adds linearity to an already predominantly linear experience, and it's something I'm eager to see them work on for the release of Part 2. Having larger and more open layouts in the levels is something that would really benefit a game like this to give the player many more options when playing through a level. It would also make the game a lot more interesting for second playthroughs. All this isn't really all that special in today's games, but The Last of Us sadly has very few levels where decision making goes beyond how to sneak or how to kill your way through an area. When I play the game today, there are stretches of the game that I have to slog through just to get to more interesting parts, which is largely due to the layout of the levels. Another thing that makes the hotel stand out is that it has one of the most anxiety-inducing and memorable parts of the game in it. Once you've gotten by all the enemies, you have to pass through an elevator shaft that isn't operational. As Joel gets Ellie out of the shaft, the elevator he's standing on falls down to the basement of the hotel, leaving Ellie all by herself up above and you all the way down there. This is the first time since you met Ellie that you're separated, and I think this adds to the anxiety a bit. You're not sure if she can hold her own or what's going to happen to her if you're not around to protect her, which was definitely a thought when this part was designed. But in addition to that, the hotel basement is just the fucking worst place. I both love and hate playing through this every time. The basement has this very tangible nightmarish stench to it. The music that has previously been beautiful and provided a lot of atmosphere to scenic places or important moments in the game is not found here, nor is the intense music found in combat sections here. The basement's music is like someone who's never seen a guitar tried to tune it and then gave it to Freddy Krueger to play on while someone is maxing out the air conditioning while banging on it to make it work better. Everything is rotten. More so than usual. The walls are water damaged and has this yellow-green tint to it straight out of a David Fincher movie. You have these cheap fucking jump scares in the form of the loudest fucking furniture in the world falling in front of you, and the worst goddamn timing for a halogen light to spontaneously destroy itself. There are dead bodies floating under the water with lots of trash, rats running around in posses like it's the 1300s in Europe, and not to mention sounds of shit getting moved around and just random screams making it feel like a clicker is waiting around every corner. There is really no respite to be found in the hotel basement, and what's even worse is that the real horror hasn't even started yet. This is just to get you in the mood to get you scared when the infected inevitably come. My first time playing through this, I didn't. I just stopped here. I remember it vividly. I had just bought the game and had been playing it for hours. It was around 4 AM, which is way too late for me to be playing something genuinely scary all alone, so I just turned off the PS4, put down the controller and went to bed. But in all seriousness, the hotel basement does have an interesting twist to gameplay that I think is only found here and 2 other times when the infected already know your location beforehand. You see, this section is considerably more scripted than many other parts of the game. It plays more like a set piece than anything else. No infected will spawn before you pick up the hotel keycard or start the generator, and once you do interact with one of them, all the infected that do spawn here instantly knows your location for some reason. If you pick up the hotel keycard first, only a couple infected will spawn. No clickers though, only stalkers. So it's easy to deal with if you put yourself in a corner and wait for them to come to you, as they can be one shot with a headshot using their revolver or using the shotgun up close. However, if you choose to start the generator first without picking up the keycard, I'd say you're pretty much dead on most difficulty settings. Which is what I think most people will do on their first time through this, since the generator is the easiest of the two to find. The second the generator is turned on, the whole place comes to life with the dead, and it's a mess if you don't know where to go. Without searching where to go beforehand, you're gonna get overrun by infected, and not to mention the bloater that also spawns here. After dying once to the infected by activating the generator, the smart thing to do here is to search the whole area before touching anything. Find the door that the keycard connects to prior to picking it up, so that you know where to go and can start formulating a route to take to get there the fastest. Remember to interact with the door, because the door that the keycard connects to is programmed so that Joel has to pull the handle once before he will use the keycard, even if he's already picked up the keycard, which can be really annoying and detrimental to you making it out of there after all the infected have spawned and are on your heels. When that is done, Joel will use the keycard instantly next time you try. Then go to pick up the hotel keycard, kill the stalkers, start the generator and get the hell out of there as quick as possible. And even though I now know all this, I simultaneously dread and look forward to this part every time I play through the game. The tension of every single infected in the area suddenly knowing my location and running towards me is terrifying. Even though I now usually make it out without dying a single time here, that tension never goes away. With the hotel basement over with, we can finally breathe. For a minute, before the game puts you up against the other group of hunters that inhabit the hotel. I don't mind this, and I actually think it works quite well not having a longer relaxing section after the hell the player has just been put through, since in this case the combat against the humans contrasts so heavily with the hotel basement that is likely still on the player's mind, letting the player feel relieved and happy and actually take joy in finally getting to kill more humans and be rid of the infected, which is a whole nother level of sick, and I love it. It's also not what I would have expected, considering that having more combat that soon after a traumatic level seems counterintuitive and would lessen the impact of the previous level when the player doesn't have time to process it. But in my opinion, it just works so much better having this easy combat obstacle almost right afterwards to both empower the player and emphasize the severity of the challenge they just got through. After the hunters are dealt with, Joel finds a ladder to climb over a wall. However, as he nears the top, another hunter ambushes him and kicks him down. They struggle for a while, as the player has to mash some buttons here that doesn't matter. This button prompt right here while Joel is being drowned literally doesn't matter. Whether or not you press it, Ellie will come and pick up the gun and shoot the guy. I don't know why it's there, but I wish it wasn't, since that's the case. When Ellie picks up the gun and shoots the guy, it transitions into a cutscene, where Joel acts pissy about Ellie saving his life, expressing that she could just as easily have mistakenly shot him in that situation, since she can't be trusted with a gun. Ellie, rightfully I might add, thinks this is bullshit and tries to get a thank you from Joel, but he refuses of course, Joel still being unable to trust Ellie or show any emotion at all to her, so he shuts her down and moves along. This is where the longer, calmer section comes along, but with a kind of awkward irony. While the player roams around looking for loot, Ellie is acting like a snarky teenager, sort of as a payback for Joel acting so immature. She obediently follows his commands like Joel wants, but not without expressing her distaste for how she's being treated. I have no other way of describing it than being very awkward or uncomfortable. Joel, being you the player, is obviously in the wrong, and Ellie has proven herself to be capable enough to have your back at this point, but Joel just refuses to accept it, and you have to pay the price of having to sit through it because of his immaturity. So after scouring the area for resources, solving a puzzle, and playing some piano, they encounter more hunters. This time, however, Joel gives Ellie a rifle to have his back while he goes out killing again. He's obviously realized that he doesn't have to do everything himself, and that Ellie can be trusted to help him, as she has proven many times. He even admits to his mistake earlier when he refused to thank Ellie for saving his life. It's a pretty heartwarming moment between them, only slightly undercut by the fact that he's teaching Ellie to kill people. The combat and layout of this level is pretty standard, and I don't have much to say about it that hasn't already been said now. The only thing of interest here is that the game sort of relies on the player getting seen by the hunters at some point in this level, since the following cutscene that plays after you've cleared out the area has Ellie ask Joel if she did okay with the gun, even though if you stealthily killed everyone in the area, she wouldn't have fired a single shot. This doesn't really make any sense, and is something that the developers should have thought of. This was a mistake, because I think many people will try to stealthily kill as many as possible to conserve ammo, and it's way too easy not getting caught here. If they were so insistent on having the cutscene play out that way, they could have made this level impossible, or close to impossible to stealth through. They even could have thrown the player right into combat to ensure that the cutscene would make sense, even though I wouldn't recommend doing that. For example, they could have added that the hunters would get reinforcements after you killed a certain amount of people, and that they already know your location, forcing you out of your stealth and letting Ellie naturally enter the combat. It's not a perfect solution, but it would make sure that the cutscene made sense at least. Moving on, you encounter a Humvee that I absolutely hated on my first playthrough. The Humvee will shoot you on sight and deal a lot of damage, and it's placed right in your path. I tried for so long to figure out a way to destroy it that I wasted all of my explosives and lots of my ammo. It seemed really intuitive to me that you have to destroy the car to get past it, even though it doesn't react to any explosives or bullets that you throw at it. What you're supposed to do is just run past it and keep evading it. Ideally, you should use a smoke grenade to get past it unscathed. I wish this had been telegraphed better somehow, but at the same time I'm not sure if that was just my experience and most people figured it out easily. If you had a similar experience or thought this was really obvious, you could leave a comment, since I'm genuinely interested in what people think of this Humvee puzzle thing. And before you guys mention it, I am aware that the game will give the player a hint for how to get past the Humvee if you're stuck for too long, but that is a very cheap way to communicate to the player how to get past an obstacle, and is something I try not to use unless I meet a brick wall. Now, having obtained all the craftable items in the game, I think it's appropriate that we talk a little about how the player can customize Joel, using craftable items, training manuals, and upgradable skills. Let's start off with the items. While walking around in the world, it's common to find blades, bindings, rags, alcohol, explosives, and sugar. These are craftable components that can be combined in 6 different combinations to create very useful items. However, many of those items require the same components to be made, forcing the player to make a decision between the 2 items, depending on what the player needs right now. With an alcohol and a rag, the player can create either a Molotov cocktail or a health kit. Using the blade and a binding, the player can decide to craft a shiv or upgrade their melee weapon. And lastly, the player can decide to use a blade with an explosive to create a nail bomb, or a sugar with an explosive to create a smoke bomb. It's a clever system that makes the player give up one item in favor of another, most of the time. In the crafting system, there are some choices that are objectively just better than others, like the health kit and the Molotov. Health kits are often useful for obvious reasons. The Last of Us does not have regenerative health. The only way to regain health without using a health kit is to find food scarcely scattered throughout the world, but it's usually not enough to keep the player healthy, making health kits something the player will have to craft often. But crafting it will give up the chance to make a Molotov cocktail, which is one of the better offensive items in the game, especially versus infected, who will all run to the sound of the Molotov breaking and burn to death. So the choice between crafting the best defensive item and perhaps the best offensive item in the game is something the player has to regularly decide between. Then there's the choice between upgrading your melee weapon or crafting a shiv. This is an easier choice in my opinion, as shivs are so versatile, whereas the melee weapon is still just a melee weapon, but improved. Shivs are used to open locked doors, take out clickers stealthily, and defend against clickers, given that the player has the Shiv Master upgrade. It's a great offensive and defensive item, with use in and out of combat, making the choice rather easy when deciding between the two. However, you have another item that also uses a component that is required to make a Shiv, the Nail Bomb. It's a very powerful offensive item, but I don't consider it worthwhile to craft over a Shiv. But whenever you have more blades than bindings in your inventory, so that crafting it won't give up the opportunity to create a Shiv, it's an alright option to increase your offense. Then finally, there's the Smoke Bomb. It is the only item in the game that requires sugar, and it's also one of the most underappreciated items in the game, probably due to its very circumstantial usefulness. It's really only useful to stealth past enemies or lose enemies that have already spotted you. There's only a little trade-off when deciding to craft a smoke bomb, as the only component it shares anything with is the explosive component with the nail bomb. As the player can often craft a smoke bomb without removing the option to craft other important items like a Molotov, health kit or a Shiv, I consider it to be pretty great. I only wish another item had been added that also used sugar, so that this item would also require a choice whenever it was to be made. Maybe sugar and alcohol or sugar and a rag could be something, to expand on the choices the player has to make at times, and require a trade-off to craft the smoke bomb. As it is now, smoke bombs are easy to make many of without giving up any other options, and at the same time situationally very valuable. Then we have upgradable skills. The player can find pills lying around in places when exploring the world. These pills are only used to upgrade specific skills that improve Joel in some way. You can upgrade his maximum health, his listen mode distance if you're playing on hard or lower difficulty, the crafting speed, healing speed, reduce the weapon sway when aiming, and a skill called Shiv Master that allows Joel to use a Shiv when grabbed by a clicker to save himself. The upgrades can be upgraded several times, some of them 2 times and others 3 times, and they have a varying cost of pills required to upgrade them. Similar to the craftable items, the player must choose which skills they want to use pills on, trading one skill for all the others. But also like the craftables, some upgrades are just objectively better than others. I think many players will gravitate towards upgrading the maximum health, as it's the most tangibly positive upgrade of the bunch. It's very straightforward, it increases Joel's max health, and it's a good one. If you're having issues with getting shot at too much, I think this is a good upgrade to go for, as it lets you take more of a beating before dying. When this upgrade is learned, Joel automatically gains max health, so it's smart to wait to upgrade this until you're quite low on health. After having got more essential upgrades, I think this is a good choice to get, but not as the first one. It can be upgraded twice. The first time it costs 50 pills and the second time it's 100. However, I think weapon sway is the most important upgrade to get. When aiming, Joel has a considerable amount of weapon sway that makes it both hard to accurately snipe someone from a range, and can also mess up your shots up close when it's very intense, resulting in your death. Upgrading this will result in the player getting hit less, since you'll have an easier time hitting enemies, meaning you won't have to use as many health kits, while at the same time making it better than upgrading your maximum health. So getting this upgrade as soon as possible is a must in my opinion. The first upgrade costs 50 pills and the second one is 100. And then there's the increased healing speed that allows the player to use health kits faster. It can be the difference between you living or dying in many situations. It's a good upgrade and something I would get after the weapon sway. It's very cheap, costing only 20, 30 and 50 for each respective upgrade, so it's easy to get as well. Regarding all the other upgrades, I consider them to be luxuries. Increased crafting speed is very situational, as the player will usually have crafted their essentials before entering combat, and will only at times find materials in combat that they have to craft, and is therefore not something I would recommend upgrading before anything else. The increased listen mode distance is also not a necessity. The player can already see pretty far with it in its base unupgraded form, and Joel also has eyes that he can see with if there are any enemies further away. And lastly, there's Shiv Master. I'm very torn about this upgrade. I love it for the defensive bonus it provides Joel. As clickers usually instantly kills the player, getting this upgrade makes them a lot more forgivable. If the player has this upgrade, whenever the player gets grabbed by a clicker, pressing the triangle button will use a Shiv to get free from its hold. It doesn't kill the clicker, but deals some damage. If the player uses it twice on a clicker, it's enough damage to kill it. In the case that a clicker grabs you from behind, you cannot use the skill however. Playing on easy, the player is automatically given this skill, so that clickers won't instantly kill the player. However, there's a huge caveat to getting the Shiv Master, which makes me doubt whether or not it's worth it. One is its cost. It costs 75 pills to get the first upgrade so that the player can use the skill, and the second one costs 150 pills, which increases the shiv's durability so it doesn't break whenever you use the skill. That's a total of 225 pills for the skill. It's a good skill, so I see how it would be expensive, but the issue is with how it changes the gameplay. Normally, you can melee attack clickers, but if you have unlocked Shivmaster and have a Shiv available in your inventory, every attempt you make at melee attacking a clicker will result in the clicker grabbing you, and you have to use the Shiv to survive. Additionally, on every difficulty, Shivmaster is something that you have to unlock with pills. However, on easy mode, Shivmaster is already unlocked for you, meaning that it's likely something that you will not be aware of if all you ever played is easy mode, where you are also more likely to have a Shiv available due to the abundance of resources you get on that mode. It's a huge problem and makes me question the skill's worth. I'm not sure whether or not this was intentionally put in the game, but it lessens the value of Shivmaster drastically. Finally, let's go over the training manuals. These are a great addition to the game. It makes exploration have a direct impact on the gameplay. If the world itself isn't interesting enough for the player, this acts as an incentive for the player to explore out of their own need. The more the player explores, the more training manuals they're likely to find and improve certain skills. There are 5 different types of training manuals that give specific upgrades to Joel's kit. Some manuals will increase the number of times a Shiv can be used before it breaks. They can improve the efficiency of health kits, making them restore more health when used. Others improve the durability of improved melee weapons, and some can expand the explosion radius of Molotov cocktails. And lastly, they can expand the explosion radius of smoke bombs or nail bombs. These are all modifiers that are relevant to what items are valuable to craft for the player. If the player finds a lot of manuals that improve the Molotov, that becomes a more lucrative option to craft in lieu of health kits. It deepens the thought given to each item being crafted without retracting from anything else, and it's all tied to exploration. I am very fond of this addition to the game and don't really have anything negative to say about it. Anyway, having gotten past the Humvee, you meet a couple of brothers, Henry and Sam. They are in a very similar situation that you are. They're hiding from the hunters in the city and also want to cross the bridge. Henry is protecting Sam, much like how Joel is taking care of Ellie. They do, however, have some differences in regards to how they're doing this. For now, it will suffice to say that Henry and Sam exists as an example of what would or could be of Joel and Ellie if they take a certain path. It's analogous to the Bill chapter, where he also serves as an example of what could be of Joel if he abandoned Ellie and refused to give or take love from anyone. But yeah, when you first meet Henry, he tries to kill Joel, thinking he's one of the hunters, but once he sees that Ellie is with him, he realizes that they're good people, because the hunters don't keep children around, since they think they're just a liability and can't pull their own weight. Ellie proposes all 4 of them should stick together, considering all of them want the same thing, to get out of Pittsburgh. Despite Joel's reluctance to trust them and work with them towards a common goal, he begrudgingly goes along with this. Gameplay-wise, there's not much to say about this part. Most of the time you just follow Henry to his hideout. On the way there, Sam finds a toy that catches his eye, but Henry won't let him take it with him even though his backpack is practically empty. In the words of Henry, we only take what we have to. When you reach Henry's hideout, he explains what the plan is to get out of town, and also where they're planning to go afterwards. Like Joel and Ellie, they're also heading west to find the Fireflies. They're part of a larger group that are congregating at an abandoned military radio station tomorrow just outside of town, so the plan is to cross the bridge after nightfall and then make their way over there. While Joel and Henry are going over the plan, Ellie and Sam are just relaxing and having some fun. The camera, however, stays with Joel and Henry while the audio of them playing are in the background. As Joel watches them, you can see him losing himself to this moment for just a couple of seconds. He gets this small cheeky smile on his face while he longingly looks at them. I imagine he's thinking of Sarah and Ellie's place in this instant, of what he had before the outbreak, but is promptly dragged back to reality when Henry mentions the present situation of the world, and they continue talking about what the plan is. Once everything is in order, Joel takes a nap, and when night has come, he is woke up by Ellie, and they head out. What Joel and Henry were planning to do was sneak right past the hunters guarding the bridge at nighttime, when there are only a couple people there. Brilliant but simple. This all goes to hell, of course, as soon as you get down there. You end up making way too much noise and the Humvee from earlier shows up again. The 4 of you narrowly escape it, but the clock is ticking since everyone has taken notice by now. In the area leading to the bridge, there's a truck blocking the path, and on the truck there's a partially broken ladder, making it possible to climb up and get over to the bridge. Joel boosts Henry up to the ladder, then Sam, and then Ellie when the ladder breaks. Joel is then left by himself with no way to get over the truck. Henry and Sam panics and bolt straight for the bridge, leaving Joel for dead. Instead of going with Henry and Sam, Ellie jumps back to Joel, dooming herself to the same fate as him. Luckily, there's a storage unit type door thing here that they can escape through. As Joel lifts it up so Ellie can get through, the Humvee breaks down the barricade door and starts blasting bullets everywhere. After Ellie is through, she holds up the door for Joel just in time for him to escape by the skin of his teeth. There's a short but I find quite stressful combat section here that leads to the bridge. When you get to the bridge, there's an even more stressful set piece where the Humvee chases you all the way to the end of the bridge, which turns out is broken. There's a large gap in the middle of it, making it impossible to cross. Considering Ellie can't swim, Joel wants to fight the Humvee, which likely wouldn't have ended very well. Realizing this and the scarcity of time they have before the car runs them down, Ellie just jumps from the bridge, forcing Joel to follow her into the water. I'll stop there for a second to go over some of the details of what happened, since there was a lot that went down just now. Henry and Sam effectively leaving Joel to die was a really scuzzy move. I think it's reflective of the state of the world this takes place in, where even those who are seemingly good have to commit bad deeds to survive. But then there's Ellie, who shows the breadth of her loyalty and trust in Joel, that she would even risk her own life rather than leave him. Her character really shows through this decision. In addition, I also really appreciate the way this scene was framed. It could have been written in a totally different manner so that the ladder on the truck broke after Sam got up, leaving both Ellie and Joel down there together from the start. Maybe Joel then would have suggested he could boost Ellie up the truck, but Ellie then protests as she wants to stay with him. This wouldn't have been nearly as powerful as what actually happened. Firstly, it would reduce her action of actively putting herself in danger by jumping down to Joel to just a line of dialogue, which wouldn't be nearly as impactful. And secondly, it would rob Ellie of the spontaneous choice to decide herself what she wants to do with any influence or expectations. I think this amounts to show how great the writing in this game is. But yeah, enough about that. Back to the present again. After Joel jumped after Ellie into the river, he managed to save her from drowning, but hit his own head on a rock and passed out. He wakes up on the beach next to the river. It turns out Henry and Sam spotted them in the river and saved them both from drowning after Joel got KO'd by a boulder. So Henry and Sam are forgiven for leaving them back on the bridge. At the very start of this level, Henry finds the entrance to a sewer that he thinks could lead through the cliff between them and the radio station. So we're already off to a great start. If entering a sewer in a post-apocalyptic world wasn't already a big enough red flag, Henry doesn't even know where it leads. But that doesn't matter, because walking around the cliff is apparently out of the question, so in we go. They should have at least looked around to see if there's another option to entering the mystery sewer. The sewers, however, despite how ridiculous it is that they just went in there, is a very cool level in itself. The environmental storytelling here is top-notch. Naughty Dog really went all out in imagining how people would survive in the sewers, making this unusual area actually feel lived in, even though you never get to see anyone live here. In addition to the environmental storytelling here being some of the best in the game, it also contains what is possibly the most gut-wrenching side story. Throughout the sewer, and in the boat before the sewer, and right after the sewer, collectible notes can be found that contain short snippets of a story about the people who used to live here. And if that wasn't enough, the sewers also have one of the hardest combat sections in the game. At least the place I got stuck the longest on my grounded playthrough. After Joel and Sam are separated from Henry and Ellie because of a trapdoor slamming shut between them, you, accompanied by Sam, have to battle a literal horde of several infected types, runners, stalkers, and clickers, all in the same area. I love this part for the challenge it puts up. My first time through her on Grounded, I had to strategize and fine-tune my approach to the smallest detail. I had to take into account which type of infected I pulled and what infected would be pulled with it. I also had to think about what resources I used against specific enemies, since I had so few resources at the time that needed to be saved for the clickers. This made for a great combat experience. Weirdly enough, this reminded me of some of the best experiences I had playing World of Warcraft. If there's one particular part of the game I wish I had recorded on grounded difficulty, it would have been this, just to show off how cool it can be. I'm very sorry that I don't have that. Easier difficulties don't do this level justice since you can just sneak your way through here, or blow everyone up since you have so many bullets. Immediately after completing this part, you meet up with Henry and Ellie again, who are being chased by a pack of infected in an almost comedic fashion. So now all four of you are being chased down all the way to the door leading out of the sewers, but it's locked. Luckily there's a window above it that's just big enough for Ellie and Sam to squeeze through. So while they open the door from the outside, you and Henry have to hold off all the incoming infected for about a minute. This part can get quite hectic. especially in harder difficulties when you're low on resources combined with the small space you have to be in. I usually manipulate the AI in a way so that Henry will get attacked by as many infected as possible, at which point they're easy to deal with, since you can combo them with melee attacks without risk of getting hit. Once Ellie and Sam get the door open, it's over with, and you're finally out of the sewers. After the sewers is an abandoned neighborhood. There are no enemies here, just lots of supplies to prepare yourself for the last part of the summer chapter. I like how you can enter most of the houses here to scavenge. It makes it feel so much more like a real place, with people who actually used to live in these houses, as opposed to many other games, and The Last of Us is also guilty of this, that has buildings or areas that are purely cosmetic in nature that you can't interact with in any meaningful way. In addition, every house has a story to tell, sometimes through notes, literally telling you what happened here after the outbreak, or shining some light on the issue's story in the sewers about how they ended up there in the first place. And other times the story is told through the environment, by looking at the condition of the houses and placements of bullets and other resources. Moving on from the neighborhood towards the radio station, you encounter a sniper. He's too far away to deal with, so Joel decides to sneak up to get an angle on him, while the others stay back to draw his attention. There are quite a few hunters on the path to the house the sniper is hiding in, but their patrolling patterns are very easy to deal with. They will often go on their own, making it simple to take them down stealthily, or just skip entirely. Unless you actually try running down the middle of the road to brute force the sniper, this section is rather easy. Now, after having bypassed the hunters and gotten closer to the sniper, you might decide this is a good spot to take him out from. You do have the angle on him now after all. So you decide to pull up your rifle and take a few shots, but sadly to no avail. If you've upgraded your rifle to have a scope, you'll probably notice something is off about this situation. In fact, you'll probably notice it regardless. The sniper's rifle doesn't even move before it shoots you. The bullets just fly out at an angle from the gun. It's just a bug that doesn't show the movement of the gun, of course. It's what you think to yourself. I mean, every game has its flaws, but surely there's a sniper behind that gun that I can take out. Joel even said it himself. We sneak up to get an angle on the sniper, so you keep trying, but somehow every bullet you fire misses, and now you're out of bullets, if not already dead from the sniper shooting you every time you peek your head out to attempt to shoot him. Maybe you try this a couple more times, or maybe, if you got a good angle on the sniper, you could see that there's no one behind the gun. Maybe then you get frustrated and decide, fuck it, let's just rush the house the sniper's inside. So you do that, and lo and behold there's actually someone there, and in your confusion and annoyance you murder him with the vigor of 1,000 angry gamers, which is perfectly represented by the anger in Joel as he murders the sniper, so that's nice. But this wasn't intentional at all from the developer's part. So what happened just now? Well, I believe this is just a huge oversight on Naughty Dog's part due to the game being rushed to release a bit too soon. For those of you who follow game releases closely, might remember that Naughty Dog faced some community backlash after delaying the release of The Last of Us. At first, The Last of Us was scheduled to be released on May 7th, 2013, but was eventually pushed back to June 14th, 2013, since the game needed more work. This 1 month of added development time is not a lot when considering the whole development cycle of a game like The Last of Us, that had a development time of 3 years. I imagine this month was primarily just used for ironing out the most severe bugs that would cause the game to crash or just ruin the experience. 1 month away from release would likely be too late to fix any issue in the game that's related to the story or structure. Games like The Last of Us are rigorously playtested, and I therefore refuse to believe that they were unaware of this issue with the sniper in this section, but I believe that by the time that it was being playtested, it was too late to change this. Because to change this section would require to change quite a lot afterwards as well. If you could just kill the sniper from the ground, Joel would never have been required to enter the sniper's room, which means he wouldn't have been up there to use the sniper to aid Ellie, Henry and Sam from the incoming truck, which in turn would also mean that Joel wouldn't be there to protect them when they're attacked by some infected that were in the house the truck crashed into, which would mean that Sam was never bitten, which would have huge consequences to the story. These are also very scripted events, and to change this would also mean that they have to change or remove these events. But that isn't necessarily true. There are better ways to have Joel end up in the sniper's room without making the sniper invincible to everything except knives. A suggestion I have would be to have another hunter take over as the sniper after you kill the current one, until you enter the sniper's room, in which case the hunter you see there is the last one. This would make sense as for why Ellie, Henry and Sam would still stay back even after you killed the sniper, which is a requirement to keep this section intact, in addition to giving you an incentive to go up to the sniper. Gameplay wise, it could also be more interesting than it currently is in the game. Let's say after you kill the sniper there would be some downtime, like 10 to 15 seconds, where no one is manning the sniper rifle. If this is done in a stealthy manner so no other hunters notice you, then it would open up the middle of the map that is usually always covered by the sniper, so that it can be crossed safely, or looted, given that loot be added there. Now I recognize that my idea has some shortcomings as well, since it would require the game to infinitely spawn hunters to take over the sniper's position if the player decides to just keep killing the sniper over and over, and not to mention all the corpses that would be inside that room if that were to happen. But despite that, I think it's a better idea than what they ended up shipping the game with. After this mess, the last cutscene of the summer chapter plays, where they finally get to the radio tower, but not before Sam got bitten by an infected during the sniper section and doesn't tell the rest of the group. Joel, Ellie, Henry and Sam spend the night in the radio tower while they wait for the rest of Henry's group to show up, which they never do. During the night, Joel and Henry start bonding over Harleys and memories of a simpler time before everything went to shit. At the same time, Ellie and Sam also bond in a way, talking about their fears, when Ellie has a significant line about how she's afraid of ending up alone. And Sam, having recently been bitten, understandably is afraid of the infected and ending up like them. They all go to sleep, and the next morning when Ellie goes to wake up Sam, he's already turned and attacks Ellie. Henry ends up shooting his own little brother and then offing himself. Now, there are some things I want to address in this cutscene, and some of it can be related to Bill, which is why I've waited to talk about parts of Bill's story until now. Firstly, I think it's important to qualify what Bill and Henry and Sam's purpose in the story is. We can start out with Bill. He's there to show the player what happens when you try to survive on your own in this world. His portrayal is of a miserable man who's gone a little crazy over the years, and towards the end of his chapter, the loneliness of that life is also explored. This is what the game implies would be in store for Joel if he would choose to only care about survival, and stripped his life of anything that could conflict with that creed. This sentiment is also echoed by Bill when he says, and I'm paraphrasing now, but the idea is that if you care about people in this world, it will end up getting you killed. It's also worth noting that Frank, Bill's partner, ended up getting killed, and Bill is partly to blame for that. Frank was bitten when he attempted to escape town, which he knew was dangerous, but he couldn't stand to be with Bill anymore because he got complacent living like a hermit. Then on the other hand, you have Henry and Sam who mirror Joel and Ellie in a more literal way, but much like Bill, their purpose is also a warning for Joel and Ellie. If they are to do as Henry and Sam, this is what inevitably lies in wait for them. It's a very dark message, and neither option is especially lucrative. For the cutscene itself, I find it to be pretty good. It has some much needed levity to put the player off guard, and it sets up Ellie's motivations for acting how she does in the fall chapter in a very natural way. Then when Sam is revealed as being infected, and Henry refuses to let Joel shoot him but does so himself, you, the player, have to stay with Henry and that decision for 25 seconds as the camera mostly lingers on him. During this time, Henry projects and blames Joel for Sam's death while threatening to shoot him until he shoots himself in the head, at which point Ellie can be heard professing her surprise at the same time as the screen cuts to black and the beautiful but somber guitar starts playing. After a couple of seconds, Fall pops up on the screen, and you're plopped down in a totally different place sometime later. To me, this works very well. I have heard people criticizing Naughty Dog for the decision to end chapters in this manner, saying that it's lazy writing not to show the bridge between the chapters and let the players create that bridge themselves. And to a degree I agree with that complaint. Just having the characters grow off screen after something very traumatic has taken place is not a good practice. But in this instance and the other ones that happen at the other seasonal chapter changes in the game, it works, despite this. It doesn't come off as lazy to me, just an artistic choice meant to make you fill in the blanks by implementing all you've learned about this character so far. To have the player think for themselves now that they know the characters pretty well. Partly why this doesn't seem lazy to me is because as a whole the game is written a lot better than most other games I've ever played, which is also why I think this is intended by the developers. At the start of the fall chapter, you're placed in a forest somewhere in Jackson County at the Snake River Trail. This is a longer, calmer section of the game, which is nice, because the player's mind will likely still be with the trauma that just happened regarding Henry and Sam. The dialogue here is sure to mention Tommy and the Fireflies to remind the player what your goal still is, while at the same time setting up the meeting you'll have with Tommy very soon. I know I needed to be reminded of that on my first playthrough, as that was not at all on my mind at the moment. On the way, Ellie keeps asking questions about Joel and Tommy's relationship, which quite nicely sets the scene for later when you find him. But except for that, it's just a lot of walking with yet another simple pallet puzzle to get over the dam that powers the hydroelectric power plant.
I know. Step on a fucking pallet.
Before walking up to the power plant, there's an optional conversation when Joel and Ellie stumble upon a child's grave. Ellie wants to talk about what went down this summer with Henry and Sam, but as usual, Joel won't talk about it. He's still having trouble opening up. As you move on and try to enter the power plant, you find out it's occupied, and by no one else than the group that Tommy is part of. Their group is based in Jackson, but they're currently at the power plant trying to get the electricity back there, so they let you inside the plant considering you're Tommy's brother. Joel wants to speak with Tommy alone and tells Ellie to go with Maria, Tommy's wife, to get something to eat. Ellie's reluctance to be apart from Joel for just a little while speaks volumes, and we'll come back to this shortly. Tommy hands Joel a photograph of him and Sarah that Joel declines to take. As we've seen twice now with Tess and Henry and Sam, Joel can't deal with traumas and chooses to try to forget all the bad things that have happened to him instead of confronting these issues. So it makes sense for Joel to not want to take the picture, as it would only be a reminder of what is likely the worst moment of his life. Joel and Tommy seem friendly while they're walking around the plant, but once they're alone the mood changes. The unpleasantness between him and Tommy that was mentioned at the start of the fall chapter become more and more evident as their discussion unfolds. Joel wants Tommy and his people to take Ellie off his hands. I'm sorry to keep doing this, but we'll talk more about this later at the farmhouse scene. Tommy, however, refuses to take Ellie off his hands, and as the quarrel about this subject escalates, the power plant is attacked by hunters. After having killed all the hunters, and Tommy sees Joel and Ellie together, he reconsiders and accepts to take Ellie. Tommy was with Joel in the aftermath of Sarah's death and described it as the worst years of his life, so it's safe to say that Joel was severely affected by his daughter's death, as anyone would be. I believe he realized what Joel has gotten himself into when seeing how Joel and Ellie are acting together, and he doesn't want Joel to have to go through the possibility of the figurative death of another daughter, coupled with his own sense of duty to try to save the world as a former Firefly. While Tommy tries to convince Maria to go along with this, Ellie asks Joel what they're arguing about, but gets shot down by Joel saying that they'll talk about it later, which she rightly determines is bullshit, as Joel never wants to talk about anything deeper than a puddle. Ellie, being tired of Joel treating her badly and trying to get rid of her, runs away on horseback. I don't have much to say about this part where you search for Ellie on horseback, other than that it's a nice change of pace. The music and scenery is beautiful, but I feel like it's disrupted by the hunters that ambush you in the middle of it. It feels like an unnecessary combat section that's forced in there to keep the player from getting bored. The horse ride feels like it was supposed to be an introspective journey about whether or not leaving Ellie is the right choice for Joel, and cramming some combat in there messes with that, especially right after the quite lengthy fight with the hunters in the power plant. I also have no idea how Ellie got past those hunters in the forest unnoticed, but I might have missed the path she took since the horse's tracks aren't all that visible in the mud. But anyway, if you've ever played this game, you know what's coming now. The farmhouse scene is one of the most memorable moments in the game, and for good reason. It's important to remember here that Joel is shaken by Henry and Sam's death, even if he doesn't show it, by the fact that this could very well happen to him and Ellie. At this point in the story, they're both realizing that they're growing closer to each other, something that clashes with Joel's impulse to distance himself from Ellie, since unlike Ellie's greatest fear is ending up all alone, Joel's fear is to lose his daughter again. The player arrives at a farmhouse where Ellie is hiding in a young girl's room reading her diary. Joel comes in to bring Ellie back with him, criticizing her behavior running off like that, basically saying she needs to stay in line and do whatever Joel thinks is best. But Ellie stands her ground. They're going to talk now, no more bullshit. She wants Joel to admit that he's wanted to get rid of her all this time, but he's still avoiding her question. She then turns the question Sam asked her in the radio tower onto Joel, asking what he's so afraid of, adding that she's not like Sam, she can't get infected and can take care of herself, but Joel is still evading her. In a last-ditch effort to make Joel confront her, Ellie brings up Sarah, saying she's not her, that he doesn't have to be afraid she's going to end up like her. This crosses a line for Joel. He warns her to stop talking about this, but she goes on about how she has experienced loss just like Joel has, and now all she has left is him. He's the only one she feels safe with, so him trying to push her over on someone else is something she'll fight against with all her power. Joel has had enough at this point. He puts his foot down and shuts down the conversation by disavowing her as a substitute for his daughter and him as her father, then decides that they will be going their separate ways after this. Interestingly, this sentiment is later turned on his head in another great cutscene, but we'll get to that in the winter chapter. As for now, Tommy arrives to warn Joel that they've been found by hunters, which is where the cutscene ends. While you fight the hunters in the house, the relationship between Joel and Ellie is in the air, lending the combat here some extra tension. Following the hunters, another cutscene plays of the three of you riding back to Jackson. It's also an introspective horseback ride, but I think it works much better here. Maybe because the player doesn't have control in this scene. It's something that is watched and consumed by the player, letting you feel with Joel instead of controlling him. It's also not disrupted by any combat to take your mind off the pressing issue of Joel and Ellie's relationship and where it's headed. When they arrive outside of Jackson, to the surprise of Tommy and Ellie, Joel has decided he'll take Ellie to the Fireflies himself, lying to Tommy that he changed his mind because he's afraid of what Maria would do to him if Tommy got hurt while escorting Ellie. But I think Tommy knows the real reason. Joel is accepting that he's growing closer to Ellie and is willing to take the risk again. The risk of loving someone, despite what Henry and Sam's story says is the inevitable outcome of this. Some time has passed as Joel and Ellie have already traveled across the state of Wyoming from Jackson to the University of Eastern Colorado, the UEC, where Tommy said the Fireflies had a laboratory. On the university campus, you get to explore a lot of buildings to gather supplies at your own pace. It's very open, which lends to the feeling that this really was a place where people used to live and work in the past. This also means that there's a bit of downtime here, which is filled with dialogue between Joel and Ellie. Their relationship has noticeably grown at this point in the story. They talk like friends, sharing intimate details about each other, and jokingly commenting on their surroundings, something that Joel wouldn't even have thought of doing with Ellie earlier. Although, Joel still has his limits to how much he can share when Ellie is pryingly asking him questions about his past. I should also mention that the attention to detail in some of these places here are downright impressive. Walking through the dorms really took me back to my university years. They really do feel that realistic, with tiny rooms containing a small workplace, instruments, pictures of friends and loved ones, shared bathrooms, and all the rooms look like a fucking mess due to the apocalyptic event that has happened. But funnily enough, that also just makes them more immersive, to me at least. Here on the university campus you find the flamethrower, right besides a workbench, and seeing as we've now collected all the upgradable items in the game, I guess this is as good a time as any to address the weapon upgrade system. So, depending on how adventurous the player has been up until this point will determine how many parts that have been collected to spend on upgrades for the weapons. The upgrades are mostly quality of life improvements to the gameplay, but can be quite significant in some cases. Throughout the world you can find workbenches where Joel can upgrade all ranged weapons that have been collected, given that the player has found enough parts to buy the upgrade. In addition to this, toolboxes can be found that level up the upgrading skill, giving the player the ability to further upgrade certain weapon mods and also unlock entirely new mods. Much like the workbenches, these toolboxes are also spread out in different places you'll journey through. There are a total of 5 toolboxes that can be found. More often than not, the toolboxes are in close proximity to a workbench, giving the player an opportunity to instantly take advantage of newly found tools. The first chance the player has to find a set of tools are in Bill's town, in the church basement. If the player misses the toolbox there, it will reappear later on in the garage right before the high school. The second toolbox is found in Pittsburgh, inside the garage right next to where Joel and Ellie got ambushed after leaving Bill's town. The third set of tools are found inside the sewers with Henry and Sam. It can be found either right after the generator is turned on in the equipment storage to the left, or if you miss that, it can be found later in the sewer after you're separated from Henry and Ellie. As for the fourth toolbox, it is inside the science building on the university campus. To get this toolbox, a full shiv is needed to open the door. The last pair of tools are found in the bus depot and the spring chapter, inside one of the triage tents, shortly after having encountered the giraffes. Now for the weapon upgrades themselves, parts are spent individually on each weapon, so buying an upgrade like increased power for one weapon will not affect anything else than that specific weapon's damage. I like this. Instead of just buying a perk that will passively increase the damage you deal with all weapons, this gives the player more agency to customize their weapons to their playstyle, making every Joel a little different depending on who's playing. A complete list of all available upgrades for the weapons are as follows. Armor piercing, making your bullets go through armor. The plates that grow on infected, seen on clickers and bloaters, act as armor that can be pierced. Some hunters also wear helmets that will often negate enough damage to keep you from getting a one-shot kill in the head, but armor piercing can bypass this. Lastly, when you find the fireflies, all the enemies have SWAT gear covering their whole bodies. Armor piercing is a huge help to have unlocked for your weapons when fighting them. Then you have power, which simply increases the damage dealt by your shots. Range reduces the loss of damage a weapon deals at longer range. This is mostly applicable to shotguns that have a significantly reduced damage at range. In the case for your bow and arrow, this lets you shoot arrows further. The same goes for the flamethrower, it just increases the range of the flame. Clip capacity expands the size of your magazine, letting you fire more rounds before you have to reload the weapon. Recoil reduces the kick of the weapon, draw speed lets you aim faster with the weapon, reload speed decreases the time required to reload the weapon. Fire rate increases the rate at which you can fire the weapon. Then there's scope, which attaches the scope to your weapon. This upgrade is only available for the hunting rifle, as the El Diablo already has this upgrade by default and cannot upgrade it further. Another upgrade is spread, which increases the bullet spread of the weapon. And lastly, you have an upgrade that isn't specific to a single weapon, but is more of an upgrade for Joel himself, the weapon holster. This allows Joel to add a second holster for his sidearm, as well as a second holster for your long guns. It is what I consider to be the most important upgrade, as it lets you have 4 easily accessible weapons at all times, so you can prepare several weapons before entering combat, and tailor your approach accordingly with much more variety. I should mention that not all upgrades are available to every weapon, making some weapons rather underpowered in comparison to others, given that you fully upgrade all of them. The 9mm pistol is a very underwhelming weapon in itself, seeing as the only upgrades that are available to it are reload speed, fire rate, and magazine capacity. It is already the weakest weapon in the game, without an option to increase its damage or armor penetration. It's a last resort item, seeing as it takes too long to kill a single enemy with it, making it dangerous to use in situations where you have little time to finish off your enemies. On easy, it takes 3 shots in the torso to kill a hunter or a runner, and regardless of the difficulty you're playing on, if the enemy has bulletproof armor around the torso, you can add on 2 extra shots needed to take him out. There is sort of an exception to this though if you're playing on harder difficulties. When playing on harder difficulties, you take more damage from enemies, but they also take more damage from you. On grounded, the 9mm is a 2-shot kill on all hunters and runners, if they're not wearing any armor, making it a more useful choice. And on every difficulty, it's a 1-shot kill in the head, given that the enemy isn't wearing a helmet. So if you're skilled enough to consistently hit a lot of headshots, it's a good weapon regardless of the difficulty. I'm not really a fan of any of the upgrades for the 9mm pistol, and my thoughts about what to upgrade vary with which difficulty you're playing on. On lower difficulties, when you have a lot of ammo, I think magazine capacity is the most useful, so that you won't have to reload mid-combat. Unupgraded, the magazine holds 6 bullets, but after having been fully upgraded, it can hold 14 bullets, making reloading a thing of the past. On higher difficulties, this is needed as you'll never have that much ammo. Reload speed, however, is what I would recommend, since you'll often be out of ammo, and finding 1 or 2 bullets mid-combat is something that is very likely to happen several times. And in those situations, reloading as quickly as possible can be what saves your ass from getting mauled, eaten, or shot. The Last of Us is not a game where you'll be pumping out bullets as fast as you can, hoping you can connect as many as possible in the shortest time window possible. The gunplay is careful and methodical due to a severe lack of bullets available to you, and the recoil almost every weapon has after firing, in addition to the weapon's weight that makes it difficult to hit a series of shots. I therefore think fire rate is hands down the worst upgrade to get for any weapon. However, if you must get it, the 9mm pistol might just be the least terrible weapon to get it for, but it would still be a waste of parts in my opinion, and only relevant for those aiming to get the fully upgrade all weapons achievement. Next down you have the revolver. It's a significantly more powerful gun than the 9mm, but only holds 6 rounds. The reload time is quite high, so it's important to make every shot count when you decide to use it. Upgrades available for the revolver are increased fire rate and reload speed. With increased reload speed, this weapon can be very good, seeing as its main problem, for me at least, is its high reload time and a small magazine size, which together means that you'll likely be reloading with this gun a lot. On easy, it's a 2-shot kill, 3-shot if they're wearing armor. However, on grounded, it's a 1-shot kill regardless of where you hit, and 2 shots if they're wearing armor. Against clickers, it takes 2 shots to the head to kill them, or 4 to the body. The hunting rifle is a personal favorite due to its long range accuracy and power. In its base, unupgraded form, it deals as much damage as the revolver, but only holds one bullet at a time before you have to reload. This makes it pretty mediocre, as it's basically a worse revolver. With upgrades on the other hand, the hunting rifle is what I consider to be the very best weapon in the game. It has reload speed, clip capacity, scope, armor piercing and power available as upgrades. And if you fully upgrade it, it becomes one of the strongest weapons in the game. With the exception of reload speed and a fully upgraded scope, all the upgrades are very valuable for the hunting rifle. Getting headshots from long distances become trivial with the scope. The fully upgraded scope, however, adds even more magnification to the scope, to an unnecessary degree. The magnification that the scope gets is overkill, as you never have to shoot anything from that far away anyway. Ideally, you only upgrade the scope once, as it can't be reverted after the fact. As I mentioned, the hunting rifle can only hold one bullet at a time. At this point, the reload speed upgrade does have some merit to it, in the case that you miss a shot and quickly have to fire another. But after getting the clip capacity upgrade, so that the rifle can hold 3 bullets, it becomes useless, as you rarely have to reload the weapon within a short time frame. This is especially true for harder difficulties when you will rarely have a surplus of ammo for the rifle. And lastly, when armor piercing and power is fully upgraded, it will always one-shot kill hunters, despite their armor. It will also kill clickers with one headshot. The shotgun is also a weapon I consider to be really good, even in its base form. Its upgrades are reload speed, fire rate, clip capacity, recoil, and range. I see these upgrades as luxuries if you really like to use the shotgun, as none of them are necessary for the shotgun to be good, but they are nice to have, you know. I view increasing the range of the weapon as a waste of parts, as you already have the weapons that work well at a moderate range. These parts are better spent elsewhere. If I had to choose one of the upgrades, I would take clip capacity, since the only problem with the shotgun is its magazine size of 4 that can often run out in stressful situations. It's harder to accurately find out the damage of the shotgun, seeing as it's so dependent on the range of the enemy. If the enemy is close range, it will generally always be a one-shot kill. And by close range I mean about anything less than 2 meters, or 6.5 feet for you heathens on the other side of the pond. Anything further away than that will often not be a one-shot kill. As for the bow and arrow, it has reload speed, range and draw speed as upgrades. Unlike all other weapons, the bow has a set range where you can shoot arrows, in addition to travel time for the arrows. When it's unupgraded, the range is quite underwhelming, and also has an arcing trajectory that can make it difficult to hit targets from longer distances. To gain more range, the bow and the camera has to be aimed upwards, which can make it awkward to hit enemies since you can't see them anymore. Many enemies are also moving, making it doubly hard to hit them when having to do this. That's why range is the most important upgrade to get for the bow. It removes the need to arc your shots, and in general just gives you the opportunity to take out enemies from a longer distance. Since the bow is the only silent ranged weapon in the game, with only the arrow's impact with the terrain making noise, being able to shoot at a longer distance is very valuable. I consider the reload speed and draw speed upgrades to be rather useless for the bow. This is because the bow is most often used to stealthily take out as many enemies as possible at a range before getting spotted. While you're still undetected, there is rarely any stress to quickly reload your bow or draw the bow. You generally have a lot of time to engage the enemy in your own time. And if you miss your shot, you won't be instantly detected, so there's no rush in quickly shooting another arrow. As for the bow's strength, the power of the shot increases the more you pull the arrow back. All my research with the bow has been tried with arrows at full power, since that is when you usually fire. So if fully pulled back, it one-shot kills clickers if you get a headshot, otherwise it's 2 shots in the body. This is true for all difficulties. For normal infected enemies and humans, it's different though. If you're playing on easier difficulties, it's either a headshot to kill or 2 shots in the body, regardless of their armor. However, if you're playing on grounded, the bow will one-shot kill anyone without armor. An enemy with armor though requires 2 shots in the body to take out, but only 1 shot to the head. Now for the El Diablo. It's one of the strongest weapons in the game in its base form, and is also elevated a lot by its upgrades. In many ways it's similar to the hunting rifle, even in its upgrades, and which ones that are beneficial to the gun. Reload speed, fire rate, clip capacity, and armor piercing are the available upgrades. The El Diablo's power can't be upgraded, so just off the bat, armor piercing is a must-have, so that you can ignore armor and still get your damage through. An interesting side note about the El Diablo and the hunting rifle is that if you've fully upgraded the armor piercing, they are the only guns that only needs 2 bullets to take out a bloater, granted you hit them in the head, making them very valuable weapons when fighting them. And this is true regardless of what difficulty you're on. Concerning reload speed, as was also the case with the hunting rifle, it's a handy upgrade to have prior to getting the clip capacity upgrade, but afterwards it's rather useless for the same reasons. And again, fire rate is something I suggest never upgrading. It's a trash upgrade for most weapons, but especially trash for the El Diablo. For a gun like the 9mm pistol, where you'll be pumping out bullets quickly and with significantly less recoil than the El Diablo, it's something that at least has some value, but for the El Diablo, it's utterly useless. After every shot you take, you will experience significant knockback, forcing you to wait before shooting again, so an increased fire rate will do nothing for you. As far as I'm concerned, the parts used to get the fire rate upgrade will be better spent if you throw them in the trash, so that some other survivor can find some use for them. As for the sawed-off shotgun, or the shorty as it's known in game, it is very similar to the normal shotgun, with the main difference being that it's not a long gun, and is therefore held in the sidearm weapon holster. This distinction is what makes it so great in my opinion, as I love the shotgun, but I prefer the hunting rifle and bow to it, as it suits my playstyle more. So it being classified as a sidearm lets me be proficient at a close range, in the event that I get flanked by an enemy, or just screw up so they get too close to me. You have reload speed, fire rate, clip capacity, recoil, and spread as upgrades. My thoughts on them are similar to those I have on the shotgun. They're all luxuries except for the clip capacity. And for last we have the flamethrower. This weapon is very effective against infected, since they have to run to you, at which point you can easily take them out. Against enemies with guns, however, it's very different, because you can't reach them with the flamethrower. The main problem with it is its range. Thankfully, the upgrades address this issue. You have reload speed, range, and power to upgrade the flamethrower with. First off, reload speed is useless. You will rarely ever have to reload the flamethrower in the middle of combat. The magazine for it is already huge, and if used correctly, you only need to use a little bit of flame to set him ablaze and kill an enemy. Secondly, the range for the flamethrower is just abysmal, and makes it a pain to use. You have to let enemies get dangerously close before you can start damaging them, unlike the shotgun where you'll be dealing more damage the closer enemy is, making it a non-issue for that weapon. But the flamethrower deals the same damage to an enemy regardless of where in the range they are. In addition to this, it takes a short while for the flame to start acting on an enemy, giving them a chance to attack you if they are very close before they are set on fire. Therefore, the range upgrade is a necessity for it, so you can stay at safer distance when using it. The difference with and without the upgrade is very large. I would say that the upgrade just about doubles the range of the flame, letting you stand far away from any danger while burning people to a crisp. Sadly, the range upgrade still isn't powerful enough to make it viable against enemies with guns. It really only improves its efficiency versus infected, or those rare cases where an uninfected enemy only has a melee weapon. And lastly, you have power. Using the flamethrower, there are no specifics to where you hit the enemy. A headshot or a body shot is all the same. The power upgrade reduces the time it takes for an enemy to catch fire, meaning they're effectively dead, and it reduces it by quite a lot. This means you'll be using a significant amount of less ammo per enemy, while also reducing the time you have to spend to kill each enemy. With this upgrade paired with the increased range, the flamethrower is really overpowered. It is therefore a good thing that you get the last pair of tools letting you upgrade its power literally right before the last, perhaps hardest section in the game. To sum this up, I consider the bow and hunting rifle for long guns, together with the sawed-off shotgun and the revolver for sidearms, to have the most versatile approach to combat. This setup provides good long-range opportunities with stealth to engage enemies, as well as great moderate and close combat proficiency without having to take time to swap out weapons. A second setup that is also very good in the event that you're out of bullets for the hunting rifle is to have the bow and shotgun for long guns together with the El Diablo and the revolver for sidearms. This also provides you with the same tools as the first setup, although a little less optimal in my opinion. But as is the case with all of this, it's really up to you and what you enjoy, and what suits your playstyle the best. Anyhow, when you arrive at the university laboratory, it becomes painfully clear that the Fireflies have already left this place, and moved on to somewhere else. And that somewhere else turns out to be Salt Lake City, and a hospital there. As Joel and Ellie stumble upon this information, a group of hunters spot them from the lower floor in the university laboratory, and from then on you're thrown into combat, as the hunters already know your location, with the goal being to get out of the laboratory. On your way out, Joel gets jumped by one of the hunters, and falls down one story onto a piece of rebar that's sticking up from the ground. He is fatally wounded through the stomach, and is bleeding out quickly. Joel is efficiently anchored to the ground by the rebar, but Ellie climbs down to help him pull it off, which only speeds up the process of him bleeding out. But considering they're being hunted by hunters at the moment, they have no other option. From here on, the roles have changed. You now have to follow Ellie as Joel is slowly dying, while she's protecting you on the way out of the laboratory. By the skin of their teeth, they manage to get out of there, on the horse and away. But it's too late for Joel. Fatigued from blood loss, he falls off the horse to the ground where he dies, leaving Ellie all alone. The screen cuts to black, and it's winter. Before moving on, I want to gush a little bit about this sequence, as I feel it deserves it. Joel's arc comes to an excellent end here with him dying for Ellie, mirroring how it ended for Sarah, but this time he actually managed to save her. He got an end worthy for the hero that he is. Joel has passed on everything he knows onto Ellie now, making her ready to continue onwards to the Fireflies on her own. And as for the presentation of the sequence, there's a lot to be mentioned. The numbing sound that accompanies you throughout it really sells that Joel is on the brink of death here, and the player really feels helpless controlling Joel in his last moments. You're barely getting by, slowly limping after Ellie. You can't aim properly or even see straight. All the tools you have relied on previously have been stripped away from you, while you pray Ellie can get you out of this mess, which she proves herself capable of. Furthermore, up to this point, Ellie has been absolutely reliant on Joel for everything, and this angle is heavily showcased now as she has to take the helm now that Joel is unable to protect her. From when his gut is punctured by the rebar, to when he dies. As heartbreaking as it is to see Ellie in distress by the thought of having to make her own decisions to navigate this world, it also plays beautifully into her having to overcome her greatest fear of ending up alone. From when you first meet Ellie, she has been clinging on to parental figures, first Marlene and then Joel. And now with Joel's death marks the point when Ellie has to face this fear head on and overcome it, which is what her arc is really all about. And even though she doesn't realize it yet, this sequence proves that she is capable of doing just that. Following this, the player now controls Ellie for the remainder of the game. The winter chapter begins with Ellie hunting in the woods when she spots a deer. You have to hunt down the deer, avoiding stepping on sticks that will alert it to your presence. You cannot die or fail this encounter. The game gives the player as much time as needed to overcome this challenge, since it is in reality just a tutorial in disguise for an encounter that happens later in this chapter. All you have at your disposal is the bow and arrow, which requires 2 hits to kill the deer. The first hit is quite simple to connect, but after you shoot the deer it runs away further into the woods, and you have to stealthily chase it. There is an abundance of sticks lying around everywhere on the path following the deer, making it significantly harder to hit the second arrow. Every time the deer notices you, it flees further away, and you have to keep chasing it until you get it right. This can make the section pretty lengthy if you're not careful about looking where to step. It also strengthens the idea that this is just a tutorial. I want to give props to Naughty Dog for having made the woods so large in response to players that might need it, considering it would have been very immersion breaking and boring if the deer just ran in circles between 2 or 3 different locations. Once you connect the second arrow with the deer, it runs off onto a path that leads away from the forest, and into an area that used to be inhabited, but is now abandoned. There you find the deer, dead, and encounter 2 strange men. David, and such an insignificant and forgetful character that I will just refer to him as Boy. David, on the other hand, is everything but insignificant. They're from a larger group, with women and children, who are all very hungry. The three of them squabble over what to trade for the deer before Ellie asks for medicine in exchange for it. I'm not sure why she would need that. Ellie seems healthy enough to me at least, but maybe her horse has gotten hurt and she needs medicine for it. At least the trade would make sense then, as a horse is more valuable than a deer. Okay, it was fun while it lasted, but it would just be silly of me to continue this ruse now. It turns out that Joel somehow survived his battle against masonry, and is now in need of medicine. Unlike the cut from summer to fall, where the game also jumps ahead in time without explaining what happened in between, this is admittedly a major plot hole. Had it not been for the Left Behind DLC, that provides much needed context for how Joel survived. Ellie, David, and Boy come to an agreement to exchange the deer for medicine, and that Boy is to fetch the medicine. Meanwhile, David stays behind with Ellie, so there's no chance for foul play. Even though it seemed convincing to me that David wanted Boy to get the medicine, this made me quite nervous on my first play through the game, which is likely what Naughty Dog was going for here, as we have no reason to trust them, or anyone in this world for that matter. I suspected David and Boy were going to betray Ellie one way or another, that they would get reinforcements, or that Boy was sneaking around to ambush Ellie when she least expected it, but that never happens. Ellie takes David's gun from him, and they move into a nearby shed to seek shelter from the cold. Cleverly, she has David move the deer in there with him so she can keep an eye on it. David builds a campfire and quickly gets a little too inquisitive about Ellie, wanting to know her name, and learn about her hurt friend who needs the medicine, when his line of questioning is suddenly interrupted by a clicker running through the door. They're both caught off guard, and as Ellie attempts to distance herself from it, she accidentally pushes the deer, making a sound, and sending the clicker straight towards her. David saves her, however, with a gun he had been hiding all this time. I imagine this was also an intentional choice to make the player trust and like David, seeing as how he could have killed Ellie at any point all this time, but he chose not to. He could just be a good guy who genuinely wants to help Ellie. It's okay to let your guard down now. David is a friend. All the chapters have had friends you encounter who help you. Tess, Bill, Henry and Sam, and Tommy, so David must be the friend you find in the winter chapter. The following combat section, where you and David fight side by side to survive the infected onslaught that is coming for you, sure supports this idea. Hell, he even gives you ammo, just like Ellie used to do for you when you played as Joel. This just couldn't get more friendly. At first, you and David try to protect the shed by killing incoming infected running towards it. The two of you work together by boarding up a window to keep the infected from getting in, at which point David yet again saves Ellie's life when she's grabbed by an infected. Later, when it turns out that staying in the shed is hopeless, you run through a door in the shed, leading you to a large room. Here you're quickly separated from David. You have to make your way forward alone against quite a few clickers, but you find your way back to David pretty fast. The two of you, now together again, are looking for a way out of there and spot a ladder on the floor above you. David boosts Ellie up to a higher plane so that she can go around to get the ladder for them, yet again mirroring another mechanic used by your buddies throughout the game. Both of you use the ladder to get up to a door that leads to a dead end. There's a long wait here where nothing happens. In the room, however, there are lots of ammo, molotovs, nail bombs, and bricks, all the telltale signs of something really fucked up going to happen. The following part is a grueling endurance fight, where you have to survive wave after wave after wave of infected coming at you. It is not at all easy, and is very much made harder by you not playing Joel. When playing as Ellie, close combat is a lot more dangerous than when playing as Joel. Her melee attacks don't stagger enemies, meaning that you can't stun lock someone while you punch them to death. If you attempt that, whoever you're attacking is bound to also get in some hits on you. And to add insult to injury, you only have the bow, hunting rifle, and the 9mm pistol as weapons to use as Ellie, giving you a whole lot to do with a lot less. Additionally, playing as a young girl also feels very different from playing as a burly, hardened man. Her presence on the screen is much less menacing, and you very much feel this while playing her. All this makes you rely on David even more, sort of forcing the player to trust him. After having survived the infected attack, Ellie and David head on back to the shed to check on the deer. David has a line here where he says him and Ellie make a good team, at which point we can see how much Joel really rubbed off on Ellie when she emulates him, saying they just got lucky. It's like she has stepped into the shoes left by Joel, and David is acting like Ellie did in the summer chapter. But anyway, he doesn't subscribe to that idea. He believes that everything happens for a reason, and he can prove it. So while waiting for Boy to return with the medicine, Ellie gets cozy around the campfire listening to David's story. A story about this especially cruel winter. You see, a couple of weeks ago, David sent out a couple of men to look for food, but only a few came back. Those who did return told of a crazy man who goes around slaughtering people, and the zinger is that this crazy man was traveling with a little girl. Ellie instantly realizes the shit she's in and draws her gun at David, at which point Boy returns. He doesn't want to give Ellie the medicine, as he also knows that Ellie is the girl from the story. David forces him, however, to lower his gun and honor their agreement. So they give Ellie the medicine in return for the deer and lets her go, true to their word. But not before David pleads that he can protect her if she was to go with him. Ellie declines and rides back to the hideout where Joel is. This was a bit jarring for me the first time, as I was expecting more of a confrontation to go down. And although it would be terrible if something like that was to happen, what David has in mind for Ellie is much, much worse. But before getting to that, I want to go out on one of the longer tangents in a video full of tangents, regarding AI and The Last of Us. Having met every enemy type and companion at this point in the game, I want to go over in depth my thoughts on the infected and human enemy AI, and the companion AI. When fighting against enemies, whether human or infected, there are a lot of systems working behind the scenes that determines their actions and therefore the flow of the battle. Prior to making The Last of Us, Naughty Dog had some experience with designing AI for human enemies, which was likely helpful going into this game. But unlike Uncharted, The Last of Us has an infected enemy that doesn't resemble anything seen in the Uncharted series, except for maybe that one enemy in the first game. But nonetheless, they're still very different when it comes down to their behavior. In addition to this, the human enemies in Uncharted and in The Last of Us are also two radically different worlds. Uncharted is a fun, pulpy action fantasy made into a game. The enemies in that game will run you down and shoot at you with all they've got, seemingly fearless in the face of death. While The Last of Us is a much more grounded adventure, where everyone is just scraping by with what little they have, just trying their best to survive. And the enemy AI in both games reflect that and those themes. When designing the infected, it was Naughty Dog's goal to make them feel very different from human enemies, but also believable. In The Last of Us, all enemies, human and the infected, use the same AI structure, but with a different list of skills that elicit behavioral responses that allows them to easily adapt their decision-making logic. It was done this way so that they could create characters with the ability to interact with the world in many different ways, while keeping the code as simple as possible. All of this work is undermined, however, when characters bug out and starts mindlessly running into a wall for no reason, or does any of the weird janky things that are always issues when having AI characters in a game. In this tangent, we'll be exploring what systems are used to make this a reality, and to what degree Naughty Dog were successful in doing this to achieve their goals, starting off with the infected enemy class. By now you have probably already noticed there are different types of infected enemies in the game. We have runners, stalkers, clickers, and bloaters. All these classes behave very differently in the game. The most obvious variables between the types can be attributed to their senses and abilities. Runners are fast, they have a limited vision but are not blind. However, they still rely heavily on their hearing to spot you. They are very common enemies that usually attack in groups. Stalkers are also very fast. They come off as even more agile than runners due to their sporadic behavior, where 1 second they'll be running at you, then quickly bolt to the side and hide again, only to return some seconds later. Similar to the runners, stalkers still have their vision intact, but only to a limited degree, and therefore also heavily rely on their hearing to find you. They are a quite uncommon enemy type to encounter, and are usually found in dark areas. Clickers are considerably slower than both the previous types, in addition to being completely blind. Their hearing, however, is much better than both runners and stalkers. You'd think this would be to their detriment as a dangerous infected class, but they might be the type of infected people fear most of all. When they get close to the target, they go into a melee frenzy, lunging at the target. In almost all cases, a hit by a clicker results in death. although I have experienced, albeit very rarely, that a clicker just hit me with his arm and didn't kill me. They're easily recognizable by the clicking noise they produce to move around using echolocation. I wouldn't call clickers uncommon, they're normal to find in areas with infected, but to a much smaller degree than runners. Bloaters are the slowest infected enemy class, by far, and like clickers, they're completely blind. They are, however, also the strongest infected enemy class in the game. Getting within melee range of a bloater is instant death. They are invulnerable to melee attacks and have protective armor on their whole body. When standing further away from a bloater, they will throw spore bombs at you. Luckily, bloaters are the rarest of the infected to encounter. The infected class's hearing is roughly 6 times better than the human enemies. This is also correlated to whether or not they spotted you yet. If they are unaware of the player's location, their hearing is lessened, making it easier to perform stealthy strategies, if that's your preferred playstyle. This, however, doesn't mean that the infected are easier to stealthily take out. They are still more prone to spot you when stealthing than humans. The way this is communicated to the player is that when you stealthily approach an infected, after getting close to it, it will enter an agitated state, implying that it's picking up your sounds. This gives the player a window to act quickly before being discovered. The responsiveness of the infected are also connected to the difficulty level the player is playing on. For each difficulty, the thresholds at which the infected would respond to stimuli is changed. On lower difficulties, clickers will respond in the fashion mentioned above, by turning and barking, communicating to the player that it's aware of something. Whereas on higher difficulties, they are much less forgiving and will often chase the player outright of being discovered. Shining the flashlight at infected yield no response. They lack the insight to infer that someone is shining the flashlight on them and will therefore not react to it at all. Sounds, however, from throwing bricks or bottles or something of the like will attract them to the sound produced when it hits the ground. The infected will run towards the source of the sound, but still won't infer that the player threw something to produce the sound. This can be used to great effect when using Molotov cocktails. As it breaks, a sound is heard by the infected, leading them all into the flames and killing them. This could have trivialized any encounter with the infected, given that the player had a Molotov on them. A limit to how many infected could die by any single Molotov was therefore set, to counteract the possibility of anyone abusing this to break every encounter with infected. Another interaction concerns smoke bombs. Logic says they should be very inefficient against infected, considering that all infected rely heavily on their hearing. But if used versus infected, it clouds their vision, as well as their hearing to provide more opportunities to the gameplay. This is a case where gameplay took priority over story, as this doesn't make sense according to the rules set by the game that the infected adhere to. Concessions to gameplay or story on behalf of each other are rarely ideal, but I imagine they happen all the time in game development, since games want to be interesting and have fun interactions for the player to mess around with and explore. This isn't a terrible example of that, as I feel it provides a fun twist to combat and is only a minor inconvenience to the believableness of the infected. The AI for a specific type of character is implemented as a set of skills that invoke a hierarchy of behaviors. Every type of infected have their own set of skills, in addition to a set of behaviors. Skill sets are tailored to fit each type of infected, whereas behaviors are more universal and available to all AI in the game. For example, both human enemies and infected share most of their behaviors, but do not share any skills. But certain skills will trigger the same behavior in different characters with different skills. Every character always has a list of skills to be used in different scenarios, with different priorities, from highest to lowest priority, to determine which skill is used. This is what the prioritized skills for all the infected types looks like. Priorities decide which skills are allowed to interrupt each other. For example, in the case of the chase skill, it is allowed to interrupt the search skill. If the infected are alerted to the player's presence, but aren't aware of where you are, they will search for the player. If the player is then discovered, the search skill is interrupted by the chase skill. The player can then throw a Molotov at the infected, or use the flamethrower to set them on fire, which will then interrupt the chase skill and prioritize the on fire skill. The lowest priority skill for all the infected is the wander skill, where they'll just be trotting around the environment. So if the infected aren't busy doing anything else, they'll just be wandering around. Out of all the skills, there are only 2 skills that are exclusive to certain type of infected. The ambush skill is only available to stalkers, and the throw skill is only available for bloaters. The combat tactics of the infected class is mostly very simple. If they spot you, they chase you. This can be attributed to the chase skill. When an infected encounters the player, it turns towards the player and screams, communicating that it has discovered something. This is followed by the chase skill invoking the move to behavior. Unlike human enemies, the infected will never share information between each other, as they are not intelligent, and only respond to the stimuli in their environment. Thus, if the player is spotted by an infected in an environment, only that infected would be chasing you. However, the follow skill that all infected types have, except for stalkers, lets the infected follow an infected that has started chasing a target. This was done so that the rest of the infected wouldn't seem insensitive to the player when being discovered. And lastly, there's a skill that's not displayed on the list called sleep. Whenever the player encounters an infected that's just standing still, it is considered to be sleeping. It's an idle state that reduces the sensitivity of the infected senses, making them easier to avoid or sneak up on. Several times in the game, these sleeping sentries are used to create choke points in an area, giving the player no choice but to enter combat at certain points. I'm sorry if this is getting a little bit boring and technical to listen to, but I felt it was necessary to include to properly be able to appreciate and criticize the infected, because they are very well done in my opinion, yet very janky and buggy far too often. At its best, the bugs can be entertaining, yet immersion breaking, and at its worst, they're huge annoyances or game breaking faults. For instance, there's a bug that's specific only to clickers. As mentioned earlier, bricks and bottles are scattered everywhere throughout the game and are very handy tools to use in combat to stun all types of enemies. However, when trying to use it on clickers, it doesn't really work all the time, and it annoys the hell out of me. If you throw a brick or a bottle from stealth at a clicker, it will stun them 100% of the time, just like with all other enemies. But if you've been spotted by a clicker and they start their flailing arms animation, and you then throw your brick or bottle, it will at times not stun them. Getting off that stun can be the difference between you surviving or getting chewed on by a clicker, so it's very annoying when it doesn't work. It seems like there's a 50-50 split between it working and not working. The rules of the mechanics of the combat should really ideally be clear and consistent, which makes this feel like a bug, which it turns out that it likely is. Pretty recently in a stream that Neil Druckmann, the creative director for Naughty Dog, and Ashley Johnson, who plays Ellie in the game, encountered this exact problem, at which point they said it was a bug.
It was a bug? That's what it was?
There is a bug where like when you throw a brick on the clicker, it doesn't always work.
Clickers in general, when they enter their flailing arms animation, have always seemed bug to me, as they at times won't react to being shot when in that animation. So the issue might be tied to the animation and not the specific interaction of when a bottle or a brick hits a clicker. But regardless, this is not acceptable and should have been fixed before shipping the game. It's something I consider to be game breaking at times, as you will die to this bug by no fault of your own. I realize that Naughty Dog probably isn't happy about this problem either, and would have fixed it if they had more time to polish the game, but that's not the case, so I feel I have to include it. Now let's move on to the human enemy AI. When designing the human enemy type, the goal was to make the player feel bad about killing them, since they are essentially just survivors, just like Joel and Ellie. To achieve that, they had to make the AI good enough to trick the player into believing they were killing real survivors. So then, first off, the enemies had to be dangerous. They had to act like they were fighting for their lives. The enemy design used in Uncharted, where they acted like cannon fodder, would not be suitable for this, since if the enemy acted like cannon fodder, the player would treat them as such, and that would not elicit the desired response from the player. Secondly, was that the enemies needed to appear to coordinate and communicate between each other, like really intelligent survivors would, just like Joel and Ellie must work together. And thirdly, they needed to care about their own safety, much like any survivor would do. The idea was that if these three conditions were met, it might be able to draw out the sought after emotion that the developers were after in the player when killing these enemies. There are a number of ways to make enemies feel dangerous. You can make them bullet sponges, making it really hard to kill them. That wouldn't suit these enemies though, considering they're human, and the damage they can receive should reflect that. For a game like The Last of Us that strives to be grounded, this would be immersion breaking. Another possibility is that the enemies can deal a lot of damage. which is the case in higher difficulties and works very well in those cases, but can be punishing to less experienced players as it is directly correlated to the difficulty of the game. Or the enemy could be hard to hit, which has the danger of becoming tedious for the player. Instead of tweaking numbers or making the human enemies into acrobats, what was decided on was that whenever the player gets shot by the enemy, it triggers a body hit reaction animation. The animation takes away control from the player for a second or so until the animation is played out. It makes the bullets that hit you carry extra weight, even though they still deal the same damage. That moment of helplessness after getting hit creates the illusion of danger. It's a pause in the flow of combat that sticks out to the player and doesn't let him or her forget the mistake they made that led them to getting hit. It's a simple but elegant solution to make the enemies feel more threatening. For a game like Call of Duty, where the player is supposed to be running and shooting while getting shot at most of the time, taking control away from the player after getting shot is likely not a good idea, but it suits The Last of Us's more methodical, slow-paced and grounded approach to combat. To make the human enemies seem intelligent, several inclusions were added to their AI. Like the infected class we talked about earlier, the humans also have a list of prioritized skills they adhere to, such as panic, advance, melee, gun combat, hide, investigate, scripted, and flank. Most of the skills are common in shooters, and need no explanation nor contribute a lot to the perceived intelligence of the survivors. However, I want to highlight the investigate skill, search skill, and the flanking skill, as I consider them to be the skills that attribute the most to the human enemy's illusion of intelligence. Whenever the player eludes the human enemies after having nearly been spotted, one of the survivors will often take the role as an investigator. The character that got this role would walk up to the place the player was last spotted, or an ideal place that has a view of the area, and play an animation as if they were looking for the player. If the character found nothing, it would return to its previous location and pick up its scripting where it left off. Pretty basic stuff, but it adds to the realism of the characters the player is killing. A detail I love that I didn't know where to put in the script is that when executing the survivors, they will beg for their life, which for me adds a lot of hesitation and emotion in the act of deciding to kill them. This goes a long way to humanize them, as you instinctively feel for them when they're begging for their life. But anyway, back to what we were talking about. On the other hand, if the player had been discovered earlier, but then eluded the enemies to regain stealth, they will enter a search state. In this state, the enemies will walk through the environment, clearing area after area until they find the player, or give up if it takes too long, at which point they return to normal scripting. As is the case with both these skills, the enemies will voice lines to each other while performing their skills, further selling the illusion of coordination and cooperation between the survivors. In the middle of combat, enemies can decide to flank you, determined by which of the enemies has the best position to do so. This can add an element of surprise to the combat, as well as make the enemy seem more intelligent than an enemy that would stay put and shoot at you in intervals until either of you die, usually the enemy. It's a great addition in my opinion, when it works. It's a joy to feel that rush of danger when you have to work on your feet in the middle of combat and you have to scramble to just get by. The sad part is that I have to say when it works, because that is the case with the human enemies much more so than with the infected enemies. There are a lot of bugs plaguing both of them, but I have a larger problem with the human enemies than the infected ones because they are supposed to be intelligent, and when it doesn't work, you really notice it. And that is the case too often in my opinion, resulting in weird interactions where an enemy will reprioritize which skills to use at questionable times. I've experienced an enemy running up to Joel, then turning around and crouching for cover. Enemies, specifically those carrying Molotovs, charging at Joel to use melee attacks when they should be throwing their Molotovs. I've seen enemies running at me and then suddenly losing sight of me, going into the investigate mode, even though I didn't move. Sometimes enemies will even run past Joel to find cover. There are times when enemies will attempt to flank you, even when you have them in sight, resulting in an easy kill. Shooting an enemy right next to another enemy with a weapon that is not stealthy will sometimes, very rarely mind you, but sometimes leave the player still undetected. It's never happened to me, but I've seen several videos of it happening. Melee attacks will at times not connect with the target, despite Joel hitting right at them, resulting in him hitting just the air. This usually goes on until the player repositions Joel a bit and then attacks again. This is not something that only happens against hunters, it can also happen when fighting infected. and is therefore more of a general bug to the combat, but I felt it was relevant to bring up here in this segment. The bugs, however, go beyond just regarding their combat behavior. At times, the human enemies will yell things that are inappropriate for certain situations. Like they'll yell, "I'll kill you," then proceed to back off and hide, when the appropriate response would be for them to run at the player. You probably get the idea by now. The list goes on and on. At best, the human enemies have personality and evokes an emotional response when killing them, and at worst, they're just sporadic cannon fodder, which isn't all that bad in itself, it just isn't what the developers set out to make when they designed enemies for The Last of Us. All these bugs really erode the immersion that these are real survivors just trying to get by, and it irritates me, since I've seen how good it can be when it works, but the sad truth is that too often it doesn't work. So much so that I'm confident in saying that anyone playing The Last of Us will at least experience one or more of these bugs once in their playthrough. I realize these are all nitpicks, as none of these bugs make the game unplayable, but they just happen so often that it nudges me towards saying that Naughty Dog to some degree did not reach their goal when making the human enemies. And lastly, let's talk about the companion AI. When building AI companions, Naughty Dog knew that there were a lot of things they had to avoid. Many of you watching have probably played a game or two with companion AI that sucks, and some of those games might have had a dreaded escort mission that was the low point of the game, where you had to go save or help out your companion all the time. World of Warcraft is a great example of escort quests done in an absolutely horrendous fashion. 9 times out of 10, the person you're escorting is walking at a pace that is around 4 times slower than your own character's walking speed. Whenever a hostile enemy is nearby, the companion will run at the enemy, attack until it's dead, then run back to where it initially spotted the enemy, then proceed to walk again, which gets very annoying after the 20th time or so. And maybe worst of all, some of the escort quests have the most mind-bogglingly tedious tasks for you to perform while escorting them. In one case, you're escorting a narcoleptic night elf who falls asleep every 30 seconds or so, and you have to wake him up every single fucking time he falls asleep. The process of waking him up isn't interesting either. You stand next to his sleeping body, use the horn to wake him up, wait 3 seconds for the skill to cast, then continue onwards. Rinse and repeat ad nauseum.
You're totally fucking with me.
I'm serious.
Imagine if Ellie had a mechanic where you had to go check on her every 30 seconds you play the game. Or that her AI made her so aggressive that she would engage in combat whenever she saw an enemy. That would likely get very old very fast, and not be in service of the story, as the player is supposed to like Ellie, and this would have had the exact opposite effect. To have a look at a game that did this much better, you can look at the third Witcher game. Whenever you have to do an escort mission, your companion will always move at the speed you're moving, and combat also isn't often part of those missions. Whenever you do have combat involving a companion, they act more like an extension of your character and will attack when you attack. However, the one exception I can think of to this is the escort quest called A Princess in Distress. In this quest, you're escorting a goat that is slower than you, will run away if you get into combat, and will at times just stop following you for no apparent reason. Then to make the goat follow you again, you have to time and time again use a bell that the goat responds to. This would be a contender for one of my least favorite parts of the game, were it not for the fact you're escorting a goddamn goat and how hilarious that is in itself. So now, considering how The Last of Us is basically an escort mission from start to finish, the companions were designed to have none of those pitfalls that diminish the enjoyment or flow of the game, while being in service of the story of the game. In addition, they wanted the relationship between Joel and Ellie, and therefore the player and Ellie, to flourish through the gameplay, as well as the cutscenes. In the game, the player will encounter 2 kinds of companion AI. There is Ellie, who is the player's main companion. Then there's other companions that the players will have for some parts of the game, like Tess, Bill, Henry and Sam and Tommy. Both these types of companions share many qualities and are important to the game, but we will focus mainly on Ellie, as she is by far the most important of the companions, and the care that was put into designing her reflects that. The most basic trait that all companions share is that they will always try to stay close to the player. From a gameplay standpoint, this is good because the companions won't run into problems with the enemy AI unless the player decides to do so themselves. If the companions were just scattered randomly around an area, the enemy AI could run into them without the player having done anything wrong. This wouldn't be fun, as it's not fun to lose or ruin an encounter through no fault of your own. In addition to companions staying on Joel most of the time, a failsafe was added where the companions can't be spotted by the enemy AI. Ideally, the companions would never be in a situation where they would be spotted without the player also being spotted, but at times this doesn't work out as intended, and weird interactions like this can happen. This obviously isn't ideal, but is definitely better than the alternative of letting the companions lead to Joel getting spotted as well, or them getting in danger and the player having to save them. This would just build up resentment against the companions. Another positive to having companions close to Joel is that they can trigger relevant dialogue and can help in combat, or shine a light on something noteworthy outside of combat. There are exceptions to this design though. At times, when the player is casually exploring an environment, Ellie will calmly go on her own to explore, and for the observant player, open up for additional hidden dialogue. This is however only the case when out of combat. When in combat, Ellie will always stay as close to Joel as possible. Her and Joel will even share the same cover space when hiding from enemies, which is something I've always thought was really cute, and is also something that works well in service of what Naughty Dog was trying to achieve, with the relationship between Joel and Ellie being front and center. Originally, the idea was for Ellie to be visible to enemies, but the idea was scrapped because of fear that she would end up being a burden when trying to stealth through an area, which again would just build up resentment towards her, and harm the relationship the player was building with Ellie. I want to add a side note here, as I feel it fits in, but is less important than what was just being discussed. Whenever the player is separated from Ellie and no longer has her assistance in combat, or her cheerful presence out of combat, often turn out to be the most tense situations, and the most dangerous ones. In a sense, this also strengthens the relationship the player has with Ellie, as you feel safer with her than without her. Next, when developing companions, was giving them utility in and out of combat. In this area, Ellie is much more fleshed out than the rest of the companions. She will at times throw the player ammunition or health packs when running low, assist when the player is getting pinned down by an enemy, yell out enemy positions, throw bricks to open up for Joel to get a critical melee hit or an easy shot, fight her own way out of enemy grapples, and from time to time kill an enemy all by herself. And after combat, she will often chime in with a quip, or comment about an especially brutal kill. These traits combine to make Ellie feel less like someone the player is just escorting, and helps the player feel grateful for having her around in tight situations where she might have turned the tide of the battle. Then hopefully, the player will grow to like her. Other companions also showcase some of these traits, as they can also assist you in combat, but to a simpler degree. They won't give you ammo or health packs, except in certain situations, and they will not throw bricks. For the most part, they only attack enemies, and will have some scripted dialogue at times out of combat. They can help the player when grappled by an enemy, but that seems to be more of a coincidence from the fact that they will attack enemies, rather than a scripted event that can happen from time to time, like it is with Ellie. At times they will aid the player when yelling out enemy positions, but it seems to be much less frequent than with Ellie. This might also be caused by the fact that for the majority of the game, the player is with Ellie, so she takes this role whenever she can. Their out-of-combat dialogue is also present, but is for the most part in service of their own contained story. In tough situations, the player's companions can also get grappled, which triggers a time frame within the player must assist the companion, or else they die, which triggers a game over and restart at the closest checkpoint. This ventures close into the bad escort quest territory, but happens very rarely, as to not bother the player too much. Although where Ellie truly stands out from the other companions is her progression through the game, and how it's communicated to the player through her dialogue and mannerisms, something that is not found to the same degree in any of the other companions. Tess has a noticeable change after getting bit. For the short while the player walks with her to the Capitol building, but is then killed off. And the same can be said for Bill after meeting his partner, right before you leave him. Henry and Sam's change happens in a cutscene and is never experienced in-game. And Tommy's change is not noticeable in-game at all. It seems to only be contained to the cutscene, where he decides his Firefly past of duty to save the world is more important than himself and his petty squabbles with Joel. From summer to spring, Ellie shows dramatic changes to her character that can all be experienced by the player in-game. In summer, when the player first meets Ellie, her mannerisms tells of someone who is scared and uncomfortable. She's often clutching her arm, looking downwards, and doesn't speak up unless spoken to as often as she does later in the game. Later on, in the same chapter, she starts speaking her mind more, albeit it's more surface level stuff, like what she sees in the environments and nothing really all that personal. After a while, she starts demanding Joel's trust and respect to help out in dangerous situations. She's getting tired of being on the sideline all the time. To do this, she shows her abilities in combat, using all the traits we went over earlier. After Henry and Sam's death in the fall chapter, she challenges Joel to open up and face his fears. She wants to talk about what happened. And a little later, after overcoming this hurdle of facing their fears at the university campus, they talk like equals, about their dreams, the future and the past, and sports, just having a good time. Towards the very end of the fall chapter, Ellie literally takes the lead when she saves Joel from what would have been certain death, truly showing off what she's capable of. The winter chapter is totally devoid of gameplay interaction between Ellie and Joel, so there's not much to be said there, but entering spring, right after Ellie has gone through some very traumatic stuff, she's changed again. At the start of this chapter, she's slouching behind Joel, head down and not keeping up anymore. Her mind is seeped in thought at the moment. She talks about how she feels like she's losing control. One of the greater moments of the game is during one of the boosting interactions that happens time and time again in the game. This time, she will now subvert the player's expectations and not react during it, really hammering the fact home that something has changed inside her after what she's experienced in winter. Shortly afterwards, when spotting a herd of giraffes, she snaps back to reality, and her mannerisms go back to the normal, cheerful Ellie. These are all changes to her character that are experienced in-game and communicated to the player through one mechanic or another, with probably some more stuff that I've overlooked. This contributed greatly to the fact that she feels like such a fleshed out character as she does. If all these moments were only experienced through cutscenes, Joel and Ellie would surely build a bond, but the player would be left out of that equation, and would as an effect of that not care for Ellie as much as the story wanted. To sum this up, when considering what Naughty Dog's intentions were when developing the companion AI, I think they did a good job, especially with Ellie, as I feel their efforts to make the player's relationship with her grow into a loving and caring one were pretty successful. But, and there's a thick but here, because there's a plethora of issues with the companion AI. It's great when it works, but too often it just doesn't, just like with the enemy AI. A great example of this is the companion's efficiency in combat. They have a lot of tools they can use to help the player out in combat. The issue is that they don't really do all that much. For the most part, the companions just stand around, slack-jawed, watching Joel slaughter every living undead from Boston to Salt Lake City. Ironically enough, it is when they act the most like an escort quest NPC that they are the most helpful. Whenever a companion is grappled by an enemy, they successfully keep one infected off Joel. The window of time that the player has to assist the companion before they die is also so generous that there isn't really any rush to go help them out. So while they are being chewed by a clicker or any other infected, the player can get in a critical melee hit, making it very helpful in tight situations with several infected. Another thing I really dislike is that companions will yell out a phrase like, "Oh, that was a close one," or something to that effect at the end of a combat engagement. This is to signal that the combat section is over and that the player can relax. I absolutely can't stand this, as there is no reason for your companions to be aware of when every enemy in an area has been killed. I always found it to be counterproductive for this game, as I thought they would want to keep that oppressive tension that the player can get ambushed at any moment. That uncertainty of when you are safe or not is something I wish was more in the game, and is being robbed of every player whenever a companion yells out that phrase. To be fair, the music will also often change when an encounter is over with, which has the same effect, and is also something I wish they would get rid of. I know it's a trope that can be seen in many games, but that doesn't make it okay. It might work for some games, but it certainly doesn't work for The Last of Us.
Alright, come on down.
A different issue is that companions are way too janky when trying to stealth. Sometimes they will stand up and run to cover if they're badly positioned, or just stay in a spot where they should definitely have been discovered. It looks bad to an almost comedic degree, completely ruining whatever immersion that could have been there. Considering how much the companions are on screen, anytime they do something weird, it is often picked up by the player. And it happens too often, most frequently when in stealth, which is a huge part of the game. Shipping the game in this state isn't really alright. I wish Naughty Dog were given more time to fix these issues, as I feel my biggest complaint with this game, which is otherwise good, is the AI. Specifically the AI related to human enemies and companions. So, Ellie returned to the house where she's hiding Joel with the medicine she got in the exchange. She parks the horse in the garage, as one does, goes down to the basement where Joel is lying on a mattress on the ice-cold floor. You know, where you keep dying people. Okay, in all fairness, they probably didn't have much choice in deciding where to sleep, but the basement? Come on, I get that it's easier to keep a low profile there as it's harder to get spotted by people who come by, but the negatives with staying in the basement heavily outweigh the positives, especially when one of them is dying and in need of warmth to get good rest. Getting him on a mattress that's off the ground in a room that's higher up in the house would do wonders for Joel's warmth. Not even to mention that the basement they're staying in has a broken window, letting out all the heat they'll produce and letting in all the cold air from the outside, making it maybe the very worst place they could have chosen to stay in that house. And if staying undetected by other people was so important that this was negligible, they could have boarded up the windows, or used some cloth to cover the windows in another room, making that an equally good place to hide. It just doesn't make sense to me as why they would have chosen this place of all places to keep Joel. But I digress. As Ellie goes about administering the medicine, we get to see how bad the situation is with Joel's stomach after getting impaled, and it looks bad for him. Very bad. The whole right side of his stomach seems to be inflamed, and he's shivering from either the low temperature that would be in the basement or the fever he's likely running. Probably both. It's questionable if he's even going to make it in the condition we see him in now. Recovering from this is going to take a lot of time. What he needs now more than anything after getting medicine is rest, so they go to sleep. The following day it gets worse. Ellie is woken up by some noises nearby. Turns out that David's men tracked her down to this location. He let her go so that he could figure out where she was hiding Joel. Ellie leaves Joel and takes the horse to sneak out and lure the men away. David's group must be huge because turns out he sent a whole fucking army her way. I haven't counted, but there must be almost 20 people Ellie encounters when riding. Ellie gallops away down the road until one of the men gets a good shot through the neck of the horse, throwing Ellie off the horse, and sends her sliding down a hill. The horse is dead and Ellie must continue alone on foot. This section can be quite intimidating due to the fact that the player is controlling Ellie and there are so many enemies here. Just like with the infected section earlier, playing as Ellie and attempting to take on anyone using melee is a challenge, so staying hidden and at range is the best course forward. It's a part I've always found very tense and difficult for that reason, since it forces the player to abstain from going in for melee stealth kills, unless you're lucky enough to find an isolated enemy, at which point go ahead. But in the event that you're playing on harder difficulties can make this encounter very hard, as ammo can be scarce, leaving the only choice to be melee at times. While going through this area, the player can hear the enemy's dialogue, mentioning that they have orders to kill only Joel, not Ellie, because David wants her alive. But they know what she and Joel did at the university, and therefore couldn't give a shit about David's wishes to keep Ellie alive. This builds intrigue in the player's mind about what David could want with Ellie that will shortly pay off. Getting past this encounter and venturing onwards, the player comes to a lakeside house. There are also several enemies here as you fight your way into the house. I have nothing of significance to add here that haven't already been said, except that there is another trash puzzle here that lets the player enter the house either through a hole in the roof or through a basement window uncovered after moving the dumpsters. I've always found it to be nice that the game gives the player more than one choice of how to enter the house and then approach whatever is to be found inside. This really should have been the case more often. After navigating through the house to find an exit, David snatches Ellie just as she exits and chokes her out, and the screen goes black. A cutscene plays as Ellie wakes up locked in a cage next to a kitchen, where Boy is cutting up a human. When he notices Ellie has woken up, he goes to get David, who brings Ellie some food. He promises it's only deer meat in the dish, with no human helping on the side. I've always found it to be funny how Ellie calls David a fucking animal here, but then proceeds to eat the food David brought her like a savage. Just as an amusing side note to the otherwise dark shit Ellie's going through with the cannibals right now. And oh boy does it get dark. I'll let this part speak for itself, as I don't have words for it.
Please tell me your name.
You're so full of shit.
On the contrary, I've been quite honest with you. Now I think it's your turn. It's the only way I'm going to be able to convince the others.
Convince him of what?
That you can come around. You have heart. You're loyal. And you're special.
It wasn't enough that David is a cannibal, he's a fucking pedophile too. Turns out that the reason David gave his men orders not to kill Ellie was because he wishes to groom her for himself. Luckily, Ellie is a strong, independent girl and fights back. While David is holding her hand, Ellie breaks his finger as she tries to grab the keychain hanging off his pants, but to no luck. David, in pain from the finger and angry that he won't be able to save Ellie for his own purposes, tells her that he will chop her up to be eaten in the morning, at which point the scene makes a hard cut to Joel, just as he wakes up. Realizing that Ellie's gone, he sets out to find her, despite his condition. He should barely be able to walk, let alone fight someone, but that doesn't stop him. The game is largely believable in the events that take place, if you can stretch your imagination to believe that infected humanoid fungus zombies exists and now roam the world. But this, the fact that Joel can walk and fight in this cold weather, with the only penalty being that he starts out with half health, goes too far for me. After seeing the condition he was in last night, he should be bedridden for weeks more before he can do anything like this. They honestly should have written this so that Joel wasn't in such a bad shape at this point, because this might just be the most unbelievable thing about the zombie apocalypse. The only reason I can see for why it was written this way is that Ellie needed a reason to get separated from Joel and get captured by David. And this could have been achieved without having to make Joel some sort of Wolverine that heals his wounds at the snap of his fingers. Writing it so that Joel had largely recovered from the injury, but should still get more rest, could still provide context for Ellie's need to leave Joel and lure the men away from the house, while at the same time partially solving the issue. Alternatively, David's men could ambush Ellie the next time she went out to scavenge for food. I know there are faults with my ideas too, but they make more sense than what's happening in the game right now. The writing in The Last of Us is usually so great, which makes this stand out even more by contrast. Like an ass at a horse race. But let's move on. So Joel ventures out to find Ellie. Rightfully so, he seems pretty hurt when he's walking up the stairs and up to the living room. But as soon as the player takes control of Joel and walks a bit, there's no impairment to the gameplay caused by his condition, except for his health pool being at 50%, which can easily be fixed with a health kit. After walking a little forward, the player encounters some of David's thugs that Ellie galloped past. I was fully expecting there to be a major sway added to aiming the weapons here, because there is no way a man in Joel's condition could steadily aim a firearm. But again, there is no apparent effect. Joel can even run at what seems to be full speed. Naughty Dog had a chance to create an interesting twist on combat here with Joel being injured, but for some reason decided not to do it, or maybe it was just overlooked. Anyway, in the state the game is in, the only explanation I can think of is that Joel has superhuman levels of adrenaline in his blood from losing Ellie. After taking care of David's thugs, another cutscene plays in which Joel captures two of his men, with the aim of finding out where they've taken Ellie. Quite fittingly to how the story is going right now, some Jack Bauer action hero shit goes down here. Joel has tied the two men up in a nearby house, with one of them witnessing him beating the living crap out of the other one. Once Joel is satisfied with the beating he's given the one guy, he pulls up a chair and takes out his knife to question the other guy. When he won't answer Joel's questions, Joel doesn't hesitate a second to jam the knife into his knee socket, at which point he talks, saying that Ellie is David's newest pet. Joel wants the man to mark the spot they're keeping Ellie on the map, so that he can verify it with the other guy. In fear of losing his whole knee, the man marks where on the map they're keeping her, and Joel, satisfied with the information he got, goes to the other guy to verify it, but not before strangling the one who gave him the information to death. After that, the remaining guy says he won't tell Joel anything, but Joel doesn't care. He's confident that what the first guy told him is the truth. Joel then also kills off the remaining guy. The cutscene isn't finished yet, as it changes to Ellie now, but let's process what just happened first. Setting aside the fact that torture isn't an effective way to get accurate answers from anyone regarding anything, this is pretty badass. And it's the first time the player truly sees Joel stepping into his "I'm not a hero" boots. Up to this point, the player might have been able to jot down all the killing he's done as self-preservation, that the only reason Joel is okay with killing people is because at the end of the day, it's either him or them. And I truly believe that Joel believes that himself. But in this scene, Joel shows his true colors, that he's willing to do anything, absolutely anything to get what is important to him. Even the most heinous acts are not off limit to him, and what he's doing is irrefutably horrible, and no good man in quotation marks would do this, because Joel is no hero. Just like how real people usually aren't inherently good or evil, situations like these are rarely clean cut. There is a middle ground that people alternate between that's dependent on situations and environment. To us, the act that Joel is committing is a terrible one. However, taking into account the world he's had to live in for the last 20 years, the act of torturing someone to save someone you love is not as morally grey as it would be in our world. You could also argue that since Joel was torturing and killing murdering cannibals makes all this a moot point, but that doesn't really resonate with me. The way I see it, the murdering cannibals are, like Joel, also a product of this post-apocalyptic world, and are just trying to get by, so it doesn't justify his actions. But this is better discussed at a greater length at a later point in the game. So let's get back to Ellie. She is woken up in the cage by Boy and then immediately thrown onto the slaughter table by both Boy and David. She tries to fight back by biting David's hand, but to no avail. Just as they're about to chop her head off, she screams out that she's infected, and so is David now after she bit him. She convinces them to roll up her sleeve to prove it before killing her. From seeing the scars on her arm, Boy grows nervous and starts jabbering with David. Ellie sees this as an opening and grabs the butcher knife David put down to view her arm and lodges it in Boy's neck. From the disruption, she manages to get off the table and run away. She finds her knife on the way out, and from here on gameplay is resumed. A snowstorm is raging outside, making it hard to have vision far ahead, making it difficult to spot enemies roaming the area. This also affects enemy NPCs, resulting in them having a reduced range before they notice the player too. Because of this, sneaking through this whole level is a very viable and accessible option. The hardest part with this level is really just figuring out where to go. It can get quite hard if the player ends up getting trapped in a house with no way out except having to go through enemies. As bullets are scarce here, and I'll say it once more, melee fighting with Ellie is not a viable option. Towards the end of the level, Ellie has to go through a restaurant to get further out of town, but as she exits the restaurant, David jumps her. As they struggle, they accidentally knock over a candle, setting fire to the exit, trapping them both inside the restaurant. There aren't really any boss encounters in The Last of Us, but this one with David is as close as the game gets to one. The player is trapped within the restaurant until managing to land 3 stealth hits on David, no matter which difficulty the player is on. During the encounter, David will search for the player, and if spotted from a distance, he will fire with his gun and run towards you, as you then have to scuttle away and hide again. If he gets close to the player, it's a one-hit kill. He will quite brutally murder Ellie with a machete. One of the death animations is that he literally impales Ellie with his machete, which has always stood out to me as being the most vicious death animation in a game with lots of gory deaths. There are, however, 2 twists to this encounter. The first one comes in the form of a new mechanic, and its purpose is to heighten the intensity by hindering the player's ability to effectively stealth. You see, in the restaurant there are lots of crushed dinner plates scattered all over the floor in different places. Stepping on the plates produces a sound that is heard by David, so that he instantly knows the player's location and will start running towards it. I really enjoy this mechanic as it makes the players interact more with the environment around them. It adds tension and tests the player's awareness of their surroundings in a way that the game doesn't do elsewhere, given that we look away from the deer encounter, which in reality is just a tutorial for this. I wish this mechanic was implemented in more areas of the game. I think it would be a great fit for many areas of the game without retracting from any of the elements that are already in the environment, while adding a lot to them. The feeling of oh shit in a tense moment as the player steps on a plate or another object that could substitute this would make for great combat as the player has to scramble onwards from that point to survive. The mechanic doesn't act as a cheap gimmick. It's all up to how perceptive the player is when trying to avoid stepping on them. The second twist comes after the player manages to connect a stealth hit on David. For every time the player gets a hit on David, he will change his behavior. At first, before the player has done any damage to him, he will just walk calmly around the restaurant looking for Ellie. Then, after hitting him once, he pulls out his machete and will still walk around the area, but will be sporadic in his movements. While standing still, he will turn around to look so that it covers a larger area, making it significantly harder to sneak up on him. And lastly, when hitting him the second time, David gains the ability to sneak just like the player. The encounter gets very tense from this point onward. He can be very hard to spot after this. On easier difficulties, the listen mode can be used to easily find David though, effectively breaking the encounter and removing all the tension that is supposed to be felt by the player during this part. It's so easy to find David and keep track of him if using the listen mode. I really dislike the listen mode in general. There is no reason for Joel and Ellie to have supernatural hearing, to the extent that they can see enemy positions and which way they're facing through walls. It breaks a lot of encounters by removing any difficulty and the tension that's supposed to be present. It's good that Naughty Dog left it up to the player if they want to use the ability, so that if you don't want to use it, the player can choose to do so. And in all fairness, it's a fine way to let players who are struggling also experience the game. It doesn't ruin the fun for people who choose not to use it and gives players who feel they needed the opportunity to do so. But I think it was an especially bad idea to allow the player to use it during the David fight. Firstly, because it doesn't really make any sense. David is sneaking and should not be able to be heard by the listen mode. And secondly, because this encounter is supposed to be difficult and carry a lot of weight. It is something that Ellie has to overcome. She is facing the very worst of humanity in David, and the player is supposed to feel that when finally defeating this obstacle. Allowing the use of the listen mode is robbing many people of the feeling of overcoming that with Ellie. But anyway, once the player does overcome this, one way or the other, and hits the third sneak attack, David throws Ellie to the ground, knocking her out, as he himself also faints. The player is then given control of Joel again. He is just entering the town and has to find Ellie. The snowstorm is still raging, and the same impaired vision for the player and the enemies is still active. In this level there are quite a lot of enemies, but most can be easily skipped by stealthing past them. There is however a choke point in the area that the player has to pass through. It's easy to get discovered when approaching it, and also when going through it. There is a guard standing over the choke point that will spot you unless the player stealthily takes him out or distracts him. On the other side of the choke point, there are several enemies that will easily spot the player if not careful. Either take them all out quickly, or wait for an opening where it might be possible to sneak past them. After this, it's all smooth sailing until finding a door that leads to a storage room. Joel finds Ellie's backpack there, together with a meat ledger. The ledger seems innocuous to Joel at first, just a group that's keeping tally of the food they have. But moving on, Joel discovers that in the same storage room they keep the humans they're going to eat, hanging from the roof like slaughtered pigs. He realizes that these people are cannibals, increasing the urgency for him to find and save Ellie. Walking out of the storage room, Joel sees the burning restaurant and knows where Ellie is. It cuts to black and the player now controls Ellie again. She's lying on the floor, just waking up, with David next to her, looking like he's about to wake up too. This is a totally scripted sequence where the player just has to press button prompts and hold forward to move. The player has to move forward towards David's machete that was thrown away under a chair when they had their scuffle. Ellie moves painfully slow during this sequence, holding on to the tension whether or not she's going to make it. When Ellie is almost in range of the machete, David appears and kicks her in the stomach, knocking her down. He then taunts the player to give up, and if the player doesn't keep moving forward, David ends up killing Ellie. So soldiering on and continuing to move forward, David kicks Ellie once again and gets on top of her, saying that she can try begging, but that no one can help her now. He turns Ellie around and starts choking her, while saying shit like, "You think you know me, and you have no idea what I'm capable of." You know, shit like mentally stable people say. All the while Ellie tries her best to reach out for the machete. When finally in range, the player has to quickly press the button prompt, which triggers a cutscene. Ellie swings the machete into the side of David's arm, knocking him off her. She then gets on top of him, and I have no other word for it, she savagely cracks his skull time and time again by bringing the machete down to his face with immense force. She just keeps going while the blood splatters around her, looking like she won't stop anytime soon, although David is long past dead. It's not until Joel comes in to drag her off David's corpse that she stops. He takes her head into his arms and tries to calm her down, but she is still shaken by what David was about to do to her. He calls her like he used to call Sarah and fully embraces Ellie, both literally and figuratively embraces her as his new daughter. Their audio then cuts out, and the player is left with only the chilling music playing over Joel and Ellie talking between them. This moment is so special for them that the player is left out of it. The gravity of what he tells her is only to be heard by the two of them and no one else. They get up and leave the restaurant, and the screen pans to the handle of the machete, with the other end stuck to David's head. It then cuts to black, and the next time we see them it's spring. Before starting to talk about spring, I want to go over a small point about what just transpired. Specifically about the fact that the player controls Ellie struggling against David up until the end where she herself takes control to kill him. Taking control away from the player can, in my opinion, be a good thing, at times. That might sound counterintuitive, but I believe it was a good decision by Naughty Dog in this scenario. Imagining the whole sequence by just being a cutscene would not have the same impact as it does with being partially controlled by the player. Having the player struggle together with Ellie sucks the player into her situation and makes you care a whole lot more for her struggle when the cutscene starts. And in contrast to this, I also think it was the right choice to have Ellie take control when it came to killing David. All the emotion that is expressed through her killing him herself would have been mixed with the player's emotion, and some of the magic would have been lost, if the player was to control this sequence. Another point I want to gloss over is the misdirection that was going on in the scene. Right before the player wakes up on the restaurant floor having been knocked out by David, the player was controlling Joel, who just arrived outside the restaurant. I think many people were expecting Joel to save Ellie in this scene, but as things went from bad to worse to terrible, Joel never showed up. She saved herself from David, subverting the damsel in distress theme that is seen so often in literature, games and movies. However, Joel does end up saving Ellie, but in a way that the player was not expecting. You see, he saves Ellie from herself. When she is hacking and slashing David to pieces, she was about to lose herself to her own hate and rage. But Joel came in just in time to calm her down and take her into his arms, showing her love and compassion. I believe this theme of rage and hate will be explored much more in the sequel, when Joel or someone else might not always be around to help Ellie in situations like these. The note Joel and Ellie left it at the end of winter makes me like the hard cut to spring. We've seen Joel with Sarah and how much he loved her. Ellie has now stepped into that role, and the player is well equipped to imagine how Joel would take care of Ellie for the remainder of the winter at this point, so I feel like it doesn't have to be shown. I think it has more power being done this way, as anyone can imagine anything they themselves feel is comforting being done for Ellie in this window of time. Anyway, arriving in spring, Ellie is bathed in thought, looking at the imprint of a deer on the wall along the highway, still thinking about the events that happened in the winter. It has clearly taken its toll on her. She had to face the worst of humanity on her own. She was faced against a man who did terrible things, not for survival, but because he enjoyed it. This moment pays respect to the gravity of what she went through. Even though they've created Ellie to be this badass, doesn't mean that she can't be vulnerable from time to time. And as a response to this, Joel tries to cheer Ellie up. He talks to her about things he hasn't shared to anyone since his daughter died. Not incredibly personal stuff at first, but things you'd say to a loved one or a good friend. But Ellie is still phased and doesn't really respond to anything Joel has to say. Seeing an advertisement for a flight company reminds Ellie of a dream she had, and she reaches out and shares it with Joel in an optional conversation. In the dream, she's on a plane that starts going down and she finds out the cockpit's empty. She tries flying the plane herself, but she doesn't know how. Right before the plane crashes, she wakes up. This is obviously a dream about Ellie feeling like she's trapped and not in control. But Joel, not being the most introspective and philosophical man, scuffs it aside as just a dream, saying that dreams are weird, not being of any help to her. The situation she's trapped in is this world that has fallen to the infection. And all of Ellie's life, she's been clinging on to figures to tell her what to do. Marlene, Tess, and Joel all filled this role for her, but now she feels like there is no one there for her, no one to help her navigate this world. On top of all this, Ellie is at a young and impressionable age, while at the same time in a very special situation. She might be the cure for mankind, but now without anyone to control her, she feels like she has no purpose. A little later, when Joel and Ellie enter a bus station, Joel wants to boost Ellie up to move the ladder down to Joel so he can get up too, but she ignores the player's command. It's a very poignant moment where it is very well communicated to the player the depths of Ellie's struggle with what she has gone through, and what she has to do later on. On the second attempt, when she finally listens to the player's command, she spots something up there when giving the ladder to Joel. She drops the ladder on the floor and runs off, leaving Joel to set up the ladder himself and follow her. It's a rather suspenseful moment to the player, but one of pure excitement for Ellie. Her whole demeanor has changed in this moment. She keeps running towards the thing to get a better look, while the player is hanging behind, unable to keep up with her. After following her a while, only seeing silhouettes of what it is you're following, you see a giraffe grazing on the vegetation that has grown on the building. The player can choose to walk up and pet the giraffe, at which point Ellie also comes to pet it. When the giraffe leaves, Ellie excitedly runs up to the roof to get a better look at it. On the roof, the player can stand with Ellie in awe of the sight they're witnessing. This moment works really well on two levels. It shows the theme that there is still beauty in this world, despite what has become of the humans. At the same time, it calls back to earlier in the summer chapter, when Joel, Tess, and Ellie were heading for the Capitol building, with the same line being spoken.
You can't deny the view, though. But man, you can't deny that view.
Back then, Ellie had a purpose to reach the Fireflies, to save humanity. This fire inside her is reignited upon seeing this, but this time it's not because it's what Marlene wanted, or Tess, or Joel. Ellie herself makes this choice. She finally takes control of the plane, and now she knows how to fly it. Joel didn't bring her out of her depression to help her realize this. It's Ellie that lifts her own spirits after spotting the herd of giraffes. In the following cutscene, this is made very clear, where Joel says that they don't have to go to find the Fireflies, that they can go back to Jackson where Tommy is, and live a life there. But Ellie now knows what her purpose is, and doesn't listen to Joel. She decides herself that they must see this to the end, or else it would have been for nothing. Joel throws a lingering look at the giraffes. There is only one left now. All the rest have gone into the bushes, with the last one lagging behind. Joel watches as it disappears, something that I've always interpreted as Joel feeling that he's losing Ellie. But respecting her wishes, he goes along with her to find the Fireflies. We're getting close to the end now, and as you know, it's always calmest before the storm. Here the player will find a workbench, parts, and a lot of ammunition for the following final section. While scouring the area for items, Joel reminisces about how he was in a camp just like this after the outbreak. And when Ellie asks if that was just after he had lost Sarah, he actually answers her, showing that Joel has grown tremendously. Enough to be able to openly talk about Sarah with Ellie now, unlike in a comparable situation at the university campus when Ellie asked a similar question. After having found all the items the player wants and upgraded the weapons, when then exiting the area, Ellie will stop Joel to give him something. In Jackson, Ellie stole a picture of Joel and Sarah. She gives this to Joel and he takes it, accepting that he can't escape his past. What lies ahead is likely, objectively speaking, the hardest part of the game involving the infected enemies. And similarly, a little bit later on there is an encounter versus human enemies. Joel and Ellie have to pass through a tunnel with 3 bloaters, many clickers, and many more runners. It's basically a trial by combat to see if the player has mastered the mechanics of the game to the point of getting to see the ending. The key to clearing the tunnel is really to have the right ammunition with you. If the player has a lot of molotovs and ammo for the flamethrower, it can be pretty easy. Getting through the tunnel on harder difficulties, however, can be a grueling and long experience, with how unlikely it is for the player to have enough of either. If playing on easy, like many of the encounters, the whole tunnel can be stealthed through if the player is careful, defeating the purpose of having a combat trial at the end to prove the player's competence. The argument can be made that this shows that the player is so good at stealth that this was also an intended option that the developers thought about. However, what follows immediately after having gotten past the infected makes me seriously doubt that. At the very end of the infected encounter, the player has to boost Ellie up to the roof of a truck so that she can push a crate down, so that Joel can also get up. When Ellie pushes the crate down, she screams, "Look out below," as if Joel and Ellie were alone with no danger in sight. This is extremely irresponsible considering that there are infected just a couple meters away. The much more likely explanation for this is that when they designed this, Naughty Dog were expecting the player to have cleared the whole area of infected. Either that, or this could be slumped into the pile of weird companion AI bugs or oversights. To me anyway, it feels more like Naughty Dog didn't intend for this to be possible, and therefore didn't think anything of it. It would have been nice if the developers expected some players to go for this approach and program Ellie to respond appropriately if the player stealth all the way through this encounter. Having gotten past this, the player comes to the very last workbench and puzzle in the game. Props to whoever at Naughty Dog that designed this puzzle. It isn't some masterwork of a puzzle or anything, but it's the only puzzle in the game that actually stops the player in their tracks for a second to think. Which is what the puzzles should do, not like all the other literal trash puzzles that are also pretty trash. At the start of this puzzle, the player can see that there is a raft on a higher floor than the player is on. Or if the player hasn't noticed the raft yet, the player might try to jump in the water and make the jump over the gap to reach the ladder themselves. After noticing that won't work, the player will likely look around and spot the raft. The raft can be used to get Ellie across the water so that she can lower the ladder. This is very logical and a simple solution to the problem. There isn't, however, any straightforward path to get to the raft, so the player will likely jump in the water again to look for one. After having jumped in the water and dived under, the player will likely find a door that leads somewhere. Following that path leads to 2 rooms above water. One room completely empty, likely to distract the player, or maybe it was just needed for a logical layout of the area. The second room, on the other hand, has some vents that can be reached and walked across. Following the vents leads the player to the raft. Pushing the raft down in the water and taking Ellie across the water will prompt her to walk up and release the ladder down to Joel. The complicated situation arises when Joel starts climbing the ladder and it breaks, leaving Joel with a ladder in his hand. It's the first time something like this happens, and I remember it stumped me for a second, if only by surprise. Then realizing the ladder has to be used to get back up to where you first found the raft, and walk across to the other side of the water. Then drop the ladder down to the platform there, and finally use it to create the bridge between the platforms. And that's it. Like I said, it's no masterpiece of a puzzle, but it's miles better than all the other so-called puzzles in the game. And I wish it didn't take for the game almost to be over for Naughty Dog to step up the difficulty of the puzzles. Having to interact with the environment in all the ways that this puzzle did is good design, and they should strive to do this more. Moving on, the player comes to a flooded tunnel. There are rapids flowing through the tunnel, with large vehicles and debris placed all over. To move around, the player has to jump between them to get forward. Falling into the water doesn't kill Joel, but it's an inconvenience to get back up from the water. Having skipped along between the cars and debris, Joel and Ellie have to cross over a bus. When Joel steps on the bus, it starts to slip, getting carried off by the raging rapids. They have to run across as fast as possible to make it. Ellie makes it across, but Joel slips and falls through the bus door. He tries to hold on, but even so the stream of water flowing in is too strong, and pushes him all the way to the back of the bus together with Rosa Parks. Ellie puts her life at risk by jumping back on the bus to try and open the door above Joel. As they get the door open, the bus gets stuck and flips, throwing Ellie into the rapids. Joel is now also totally submerged in the water and has to quickly swim out to find and save Ellie. Getting out of the bus, the player can instantly see Ellie passed out a little bit ahead in the water. Swimming forward and grabbing her, the player has to continue forward to get up and above the water. The very second Joel rises up from the water, a cutscene starts. Joel gasps for air as he throws Ellie up on land. He realizes she's not breathing and immediately starts giving her chest compressions. While trying to save Ellie, 2 men with guns drawn approach him, telling him to put his hands in the air. Joel refuses to stop giving Ellie CPR and gets knocked out by one of the men for not complying. Joel wakes up an undetermined time later in the hospital bed, with Marlene and one of her guards by his side. Marlene apologizes for the rude welcome Joel got from those 2 Firefly soldiers. They didn't know who he was and who he was bringing. But Joel isn't lingering on that. He straight away asks about Ellie, and Marlene assures him that Ellie is alright. They brought her back and she's in a stable condition now. Joel wants to see her, but Marlene won't let that happen, as Ellie is being prepared for surgery now. It appears that the cordyceps fungus inside her has mutated and is now growing all over the brain, and they think that's the reason she's immune. The idea is that if the doctors can remove it, they can reverse engineer a vaccine from it. A vaccine to make everyone immune, or possibly revert already infected people back to normal. I'm not really sure. Anyway, the only thing Joel heard was that it grows all over the brain and that they are intending to remove it, which would kill Ellie. He gets aggressive and insists for them to find someone else they can use to make a vaccine. But of course, there is no one else. Ellie is the only one. Marlene tries to make Joel pity her situation, as she has known Ellie all her life and promised her mom she would protect her, and is now deciding to kill Ellie for what she believes is the greater good. Joel still isn't buying it though, so Marlene orders the guard to escort him out of the hospital and to shoot him if he tries anything. Lastly, she pleads to Joel's humanity, for him to not waste this gift they've been given. The guard marches Joel out of the room. After having walked for a bit, Joel stops in his tracks. The guard then taunts him to move, at which point Joel surprises the guard, grabs his gun and turns the tables on him. He wants to know where the operating room is. Not getting an answer right away, he starts pumping bullets into the man's crotch, making the guard comply, telling Joel they're keeping Ellie on the top floor, at the far end. He then fires a bullet into the guard's head and starts moving. The cutscene ends here and the player resumes control of Joel. This is the final trial for the player. The enemies here have stronger guns than before, they wear lots of armor, and there are many of them in a pretty cramped space. Like the previous infected encounter, the player has to prove themselves to have mastered the mechanics to a sufficient degree to unlock the ending. And also like the infected encounter, a lot of it can be stealth past if you're playing on easier difficulties. Moving on, if you're not in a hurry to go find Ellie, you can find tape recorders lying around the hospital. These recordings contain information about Ellie and how the infection inside her differentiates itself from how it normally behaves, really emphasizing how big a deal this is for humanity, going as far as comparing it to the discovery of penicillin. Then, there's also Marlene's recordings. In the first one, she talks about how difficult of a decision it was for her to decide whether or not to greenlight the killing of Ellie to extricate the fungus. In the second one, she just talks about how she greenlit the killing of Ellie, and how she decided not to kill Joel, despite the pressure from others to do so, as she felt Joel might be the only one who also understands the weight of the choice she had to make. Having murdered or snuck past the Firefly grunts and found those recordings, the player is now standing outside the operating room. Barging in the room, the player is faced with 3 surgeons and an unconscious Ellie lying on the operating table. Walking forward to grab Ellie, one of the surgeons gets a knife to threaten Joel. This is set up so the player has the choice to either kill the surgeon and take Ellie, or leave and give them a chance to make a vaccine, making it the player's choice to either save humanity or doom it. This is a huge moral dilemma that has to be solved right here and now by the player within a few seconds, and the player has to live with that decision. This is what the game has been building up to all this time, and hopefully you have an answer by the time you get here. Are you ready? I hope you have an answer by now. We're running out of time. What's your decision?
No! You fucking animal!
Shut the hell up!
No. In reality, the player has no choice here at all. You can't turn back and leave. Joel won't let the player go there. Walking forward results in Joel jamming the knife into the surgeon's neck, and standing still just results in a standoff that lasts forever. The player can't decide to do these things because Joel wouldn't do these things. The only option Joel sees here is to save Ellie at any cost. So that's the player's only option too. Having made your non-choice, you pick up Ellie and storm out of there, with the fireflies close on your heels. The player has to avoid and outrun incoming fireflies while carrying Ellie. When you've almost reached the elevator that leads you out of there, the fireflies will open fire on Joel, putting Ellie at risk too, literally gambling with the possibility of destroying their own cause's main goal. Before moving on, I want to add that this section is very reminiscent of a section at the start of the game where Joel has to carry Sarah and flee from the infected. This is obviously intended by the developers to draw the parallel between Ellie and Sarah and what they mean for Joel. Upon reaching the elevator, a cutscene starts. The elevator takes Joel and Ellie down to the basement floor. Before leaving the elevator, Joel pushes the emergency stop button in the elevator to make sure none of the firefly grunts could follow them. But somehow, Marlene knew that they were going down there and decided to go there alone for some reason. She's waiting for Joel and Ellie as soon as they exit the elevator, gun drawn. She tries her very best to plead to Joel's humanity and love for Ellie, saying that this is what Ellie would have wanted. Marlene also uses some less honest methods, by playing on Joel's fear of losing Ellie no matter what choice he makes. That she won't survive out there for long anyway, so letting the fireflies go through with this is the best option. Then finally, she puts away her gun and begs Joel to do the right thing. The camera turns back on Joel, seeped in thought, then cuts to him driving a car down the highway. At first it seems like he's alone, but after a while Ellie can be heard waking up in the back seat. She has no memory of anything that happened after she almost drowned in the tunnel, as she has been passed out and drugged since then, and needs Joel to fill in the blanks. He tells Ellie that they found the fireflies, and turns out that there are dozens more people like her that are immune, that the fireflies have tried and failed to make a cure many times, to the point that they've stopped trying to find one now. Lastly, he adds that he's driving home now. It's over. Ellie has nothing to say about this, but it's easy to see that she's disappointed. After having lied to Ellie, the camera cuts to the conclusion of what happened in the basement with Marlene. I'm going to let this clip play out in its entirety, as I feel it shows the depths of depravity Joel is willing to go to, without being too lengthy.
Wait! Let me go! Please.
You just come after her.
In the following scene, Joel and Ellie are right outside of Jackson. The road stops here, so they have to continue on foot. We see Ellie is inspecting her scar from the infected that bit her, remembering everything she had to go through to get here, what had to be sacrificed. Is all that for nothing now? Remarkably, when the player gains control of a character, it's not Joel, but Ellie that the player is controlling from here on, just like the player played Sarah at the beginning of the game, almost as if the ending is the beginning in reverse. It's a very neat detail, I think. You follow Joel through the forest, while he talks about how him and Sarah used to hike together, about how Ellie probably would have gotten along with Sarah had they had a chance to meet. Playing as Ellie and looking at Joel from this perspective is very revealing. Knowing what you know now, Ellie, and the player now embodying her, sees Joel in a whole different light. If the player had been controlling Joel in this section, this wouldn't have been so obvious. But now, we see Joel for the pathetic old man he really is. I feel sorry for him, I really do. He's kept his feelings so close to his chest for so long in fear of having to lose anything else. Then one day, Ellie comes along, and over time she becomes something of a new daughter for him. We've seen that Joel is clearly willing to give his own life for her, something that is seen in every encounter in the game. He's willing to endanger others for her. Joel was even willing to throw down the walls he has built up around himself for her. We've seen the lengths Joel was willing to go in the winter chapter and regarding the fireflies to keep himself from losing her. He's willing to possibly damn humanity for her, putting his own soul on the line. And lastly, he's willing to lie to her to keep himself from losing her, because to him, all of this is worth it to have that love of your child. Even the fear Joel constantly exhibits of losing her, of him having to deal with something terrible happening to her someday, is worth it to him. That's what Joel's arc is all about. That irrational, undying love you feel for your child. There's literally nothing Joel wouldn't do for Ellie, and what makes for such great storytelling is the story pushing him further and further to see how far this man is willing to go to save his own child. But there's one moment we haven't spoken about yet. Right before arriving in Jackson, Ellie stops Joel to get something off her chest. She tells Joel about when she was first bitten, back in Boston, that she was with her best friend when it happened, who got bit too. After her best friend died, Ellie waited for her turn, but it never came. Then it was Tess, and then Sam who died next. Joel responds that none of that is on her, then follows up with an answer that is more revealing of his own character than any help to her. He says that he struggled for a long time with surviving, but no matter what, you keep finding something to fight for. What Joel doesn't understand, or is feigning not understanding, is that Ellie needs to know all they went through wasn't for nothing. To reassure herself, she asks Joel to swear to her that everything he said about the Fireflies is the truth. His relationship with Ellie is on the line, and when Joel answers "I swear" back to Ellie, his arc is taken to its natural end, with him even willing to risk his relationship with Ellie to keep himself from losing her. Ellie pauses after hearing his answer, and replies okay, not in agreement, but in disagreement. She now knows that she can't trust Joel, and can't rely on parental figures to do what's best for her in the future. At the beginning of the game, he lost Sarah to the craze that was started because of the infection, and in the end, he loses Ellie for robbing her of her purpose. Following this, many of you probably want me to mention the facts supporting and against the Fireflies organization, that Joel's choice to possibly damn humanity wasn't really that at all, that he was fully justified in the choice he made to take Ellie for himself, or on the other hand, that Joel's decision most definitely damned humanity. Either way, this usually boils down to looking at certain details that we learned about the Fireflies and jumping to conclusions about whether or not they could have made a cure, or argued the Fireflies' moral standing. In any case, it's very much all speculation, and I am therefore hesitant to discuss it at any length in this video. I have therefore been careful to dance around the subject anytime it's inevitable for me to avoid talking about it. Despite this, I have included lots of details about the Fireflies in the video that I consider to be both for and against them. It is an integral part of the story, and it definitely warrants discussion, but I myself can't seem to come to a conclusion on the subject. One day, I'll feel like the Fireflies were a good organization that genuinely wanted to save the world, and other days I'll feel the exact opposite, or something in between, where they are just a bunch of optimistic, incompetent bunch of idiots. I therefore don't want to add anything definitive about the subject in this video. I'm sorry if that's disappointing, but if you really want to discuss it, we can continue the conversation in the comments. I feel that Naughty Dog were largely successful in their goal to have a relationship blossom between two characters, from hateful to loving, and bringing the player along on that journey. The characters are very well written, among the best I've seen in a game, and the story works very well as a setting to explore these characters. If the gameplay and AI was also at that level of polish, I wouldn't hesitate to call The Last of Us a great game, maybe even a masterpiece. But sadly, that's not the case. As it is, The Last of Us is a very good game, with some glaring flaws, and some parts that shine very brightly. I hope you enjoyed this video, or found it interesting at the very least. I will be creating a similar video on The Last of Us Part 2 a little while after its release. If you think that sounds like something you'd enjoy, consider subscribing so you won't miss it. See you next time, goodbye.